I need to go to here. Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 18. And today we're going to be looking at the Battle of Waterloo, as it's Waterloo Day in Britain, 18th of June, 1815, which was a Sunday, I do believe. As always, I'm going to start us off with a tune to give people some time to get into the stream and that sort of thing.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, on flooded folk and wall. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love and heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor, are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, a loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom, to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly profit laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Guard. Do go and check out his YouTube channel if you like good music. Chris is a good bloke. He's one of us, and a genuinely good musician. Good evening to my guests this evening, Mitch, AI, and Jack. Jack, I think, is the first time you've been on one of these streams.
It is indeed. I'm very excited to be here.
But people who follow history will hopefully have seen Jack's excellent series of streams on the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens in ancient Greece, which I was most impressed with. So if you haven't seen that, do go and check it out. And I'll get Jack to do a plug later on. Okay, we're going to be talking about the extremely famous Battle of Waterloo on the 18th of June, 1815 this evening. And I'm going to be looking at it mainly from a British point of view, although my guests may choose to do whatever they wish to do, as always. But probably a little bit of background is worth having for people who don't know too much about the era. Napoleon had eventually, following his massive setbacks in Russia and also the continuing success of Wellington in the peninsula, Napoleon had eventually in 1813 and 1814 been defeated by the combined forces of Prussia, Russia, Austria, Sweden, Britain, and a few other minor powers. Eventually, Wellington invaded the south of France from the peninsula with his British and Portuguese troops. He didn't take his Spanish troops because he knew what they would probably do to the French civilians. So he didn't take those. And in the north, the Prussians, Austrians, and Russians combined with the Swedes under the command of a chap who had actually been a former Napoleonic marshal, managed to defeat Napoleon. But it took enormous amounts of blood and treasure to do this. Several times in 1813, Napoleon was offered pretty good settlements that would have given him France's borders larger than they are today. But he refused because he was Napoleon and nothing was ever good enough, and he always thought, I'll have a bit of luck sometime and they'll do something better for me, And of course, this didn't happen. And in 1814, he was forced to abdicate. They sent him to the little Mediterranean island of Elba. He was allowed a guard of about 1,000 soldiers, including a few cavalry guys. And he wasn't very closely watched. He was pretty much allowed to get on doing what he wanted to do in his miniature kingdom. And considering the hundreds of thousands of deaths he was indirectly responsible for since his rise to be the French emperor, or even the first consul, in fact, if you consider the hundreds of thousands of deaths that he was directly or indirectly responsible for all over Europe, I think he got off pretty bloody lightly, quite frankly. However, Napoleon, being Napoleon, decided, and the fact that the Bourbons, who had been reinstated in France, weren't very popular, especially with the army. They were cutting the army, obviously. Napoleon decided he was going to gamble and go back to France. And this resulted in what is known historically as the 100 Days, because the whole campaign lasted about 3 months. And the fighting bit didn't even last that long. One reason it's so famous is that Waterloo was a very decisive battle. There was fighting after it, but it wasn't on a large scale. So Napoleon very quickly reconstituted the French army. He was fortunate in that most of the French prisoners of war who had been held in Britain and also to some degree in other European countries like Prussia and Austria and Russia, most of those prisoners of war had been returned to France. And so all these guys were available to go straight into the French army. The French king had actually done some quite good work on the French cavalry. And so for the first time since 1812, in 1815, Napoleon had a pretty good cavalry arm that was reasonably well mounted. And it was also a very French army because most of the allies had been carved off. The French army that invaded Russia in 1812 was a massively multinational force. The French army that Napoleon commanded in 1815, although it was by no means as large as his original Grand Army in the early 1800s, was entirely a French force. And included quite a lot of experienced veterans, including, as I mentioned, the prisoners of war who were returned to France. The Allies, although he sent letters out all over Europe saying he wanted peace, no one believed him, and you can't frankly blame them. You know, Napoleon was a war machine, basically. So all the Allies all decided they were going to get together again and crush Napoleon. But it was going to take the Austrians and the Russians in particular quite a long time to get their forces into position. Same thing if the Spanish were going to do anything, or the Portuguese. And so you ended up basically with two armies close enough to France to do much about it. One of them from Britain under Wellington, although Wellington's army was over half, in fact, closer to 2/3 Allied troops of very varying quality. And even his British troops included a lot of second battalions who hadn't seen a lot of action because many British regiments had still not returned from North America, where they had been dealing with, successfully dealing with the American invasions of Canada. But a lot of these guys hadn't come back yet to Europe. At least one of his most famous light infantry regiments was actually in ships waiting to land and missed Waterloo by a few days. But he did have a lot of Dutch, Belgian, Brunswick, and Hanoverian soldiers. Now, the King's German Legion were actually an integral part of the British Army and were very, very good troops, at least as good as the British regiments and better than some of them. But the Hanoverian army itself was of varying quality. Some of it was all right, some of it wasn't. Same thing with the Dutch Belgians, and certainly the same thing with the Brunswickers. Very, very variable quality. And quite a lot of those troops had actually been fighting for Napoleon a year or 18 months previously. So when Wellington said, as he famously did before Waterloo, that he had an infamous army, he really did have, by his standards, an infamous army. He had said of his Peninsular army that had been fighting with him for like 8 years by the end of the campaign, that he could go anywhere and do anything with that army. But the army he had at Waterloo was not that army. A few of the British units had fought with him in Spain and Portugal, but most of them had not. And for example, Wellington, for the first time in his life, had a decent-sized cavalry force at Waterloo. But most of those regiments hadn't been out of England, which is not to say they weren't brave, but their tactical training was not always all it might have been. Anyway, I've got some maps and illustrations for this, which I'm going to put up as we're going through. But I think I've been talking for long enough. And so what I'll do is ask my guests if anything they want to say about Napoleon's return and the early stages of the 100 days before the French crossed the border into Belgium.
Yeah, I'd say so. History March did a good video on this where they said, okay, so in a Waterloo film, you have that Prussian officer who walks up to Wellington and says, "Oh, Napoleon's crossed the border." Wellington is well aware of this because in the city of Ghent in Belgium, or as back then it was part of the Netherlands, King Louis XVIII, who's Napoleon, he had spies all over France, especially along the border. So Wellington was fully aware that Napoleon was crossing the border. And for example, I think like the most high profile guy feeding the Allies information was Joseph Fouché, who was chief of police, same chief of police who helped Napoleon take power to begin with, back in the Brumaire coup. So
Yes, he was a piece of work, that one, Mitch.
yeah, he was. Then at the time that Napoleon was marching upon Belgium, he always had to deal with internal opposition. I think the Vendée region, always a counter-revolutionary region, was also rebelling after Napoleon returned. So he had to devote some troops to that. He also had to, I think it was Davout. He had to be put in charge of Paris in the meantime, because Napoleon wanted to march upon Belgium and take Brussels in a lightning campaign, so as to flush out what any people opposed to him, as well as captivate the people of France with a victory. Because at that time,
I was just going to say, Mitch, if people want to look on the screen, the map I've got up at the moment is basically France and the surrounding regions, and it shows the major French forces, the British and Allied army, the Prussian forces, and also in the distance on the right of the screen, you can see where the Austrians and the Russians are slowly marching towards the French border. Sorry, Mitch, you carry on, mate.
yeah, it's like, because the previous year in 1814, you had the Allied armies rampaging through France. Though Napoleon was able to score some victories in the end, even with the Marie Louise's conscripts that his queen Marie Louise had drafted, he wasn't able to, because he got fact that Napoleon had a shortage of horses in 1815.
He had a shortage of horses in 1814, far less so in 1815. But in 1814, yes, he wasn't really able to reconstitute the French cavalry after the Russian campaign.
And 1813, he scored two pretty astonishing victories at Lutzen and Bautzen, which in previous campaigns could have ended the wars there, but he was unable to make anything from his gains because as the coalition forces fled from him, he didn't have the cavalry arms that he needed to pursue them, which
100%.
allowed them to just regroup.
Yeah, 100%. Quite correct there.
Sorry, I also remember reading the accounts of the Battle of Borodino in Russia. And while normally that was a French victory, that was a Napoleon victory, it was such a Pyrrhic victory on the scale that, I mean, for example, that was one of the battles, I guess you could say, in that time period where he had like a decent amount of cavalry, but the toll that was inflicted upon it. I mean, of course, we all know what happened after the capture of Moscow and then the famous retreat. It's sort of I always view the Battle of Borodino as like a sort of like that sort of turning point where the capability of the army isn't that like it was beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, Borodino was a bloodbath, and I mean, Jack may or may not agree with me on this. I haven't spoken to Jack much about the Napoleonic Wars, but my view is that Napoleon was a brilliant soldier when he was younger, but as he got older, he got more and more inclined to do attacks on the center of the enemy, relying on heavy batteries of artillery, and of course he was an artilleryman. And he would sometimes even use his cavalry to go through the enemy's center, which is one thing we're going to come on to when we talk about Waterloo. I think Napoleon, because he had an almost inexhaustible supply of men, which is something Wellington, for example, never had. Napoleon became very profligate with his soldiers' lives, and all right, you can argue that in the Waterloo campaign, he needed to win quickly. So maneuvering might have taken longer. But Napoleon in his later career did get this habit of trying to break the enemy center, which didn't always work.
I wouldn't say I agree entirely. I think that what we do see throughout the Napoleonic Wars is army sizes getting larger and larger and larger. And if you look at all of the battles that Napoleon fought that were on the largest scale, with the exception of Dresden, pretty much all of them he does pretty badly in. And I think that this is revealing in that it shows that he didn't do so good when it came to having to micromanage and also try and delegate to his marshals at the same time, because he was a very hands-on person. And I think the best kind of case to back this up is we've spoken about Borodino. It's a bloody battle. Part of it was that he was unwilling to risk committing his guard or some sort of risky flanking maneuver down the south, which Davout suggested that he undertook. So instead, it was lots of frontal assaults on artillery batteries at Borodino, which is why the casualty rates were so high. But then in the campaigns after that, when his armies are much smaller, especially in that 1814 campaign where he has the Marie-Louises that we've mentioned, he actually does extraordinarily well. Specifically when Schwarzenberg and Blücher cross the Rhine, he's outnumbered 4-1 in that campaign, and he scores an unbelievable string of victories, particularly in the 6 Days campaign at Champeaux, Montmirail, Thierry, Vauchamp, Mormont, Montereau. And I think a lot of it is because he had more tactical flexibility when he was commanding a much, much smaller force. And so I think that it's more a case of him being unable to trust the delegation of his army to his marshal, more so than it was him just getting old and kind of losing it.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. Sorry, Mitch, you carry on.
I was just saying, because I remember, Epic History TV, we all like him. I remember reading something along the lines of Davout advocated outflanking the Russians at Borodino, but the thing was, I think it was the option the route in order to outflank, it went through a single road. It shadowed along woodlands and somewhat a bit swampy. So that's why Napoleon fought it too risky, and therefore just chose to do a full-on frontal attack.
And crucially, at that point, he'd already lost a significant amount of his men from typhus, which was the number one killer of the French army when they went into Russia. And so he already was kind of bleeding into his reserves at the time that it got to Borodino. And so he was very cautious that if he committed his kind of final force, specifically his Imperial Guard, to any sort of risky maneuvers, such as a flanking maneuver, and then lost, he'd be done for.
Yeah,
but of course he wasn't. If he couldn't outflank the Russians, even if he pushed them off the battlefield, which he did, he didn't win a decisive victory.
No. Oh, Borodino is interesting because it was surprisingly risk averse for Napoleon, who was always, you said yourself, Iron Duke, a gambler. In many ways, that made him. And Borodino, he was very cautious, and it's the sort of caution that he didn't show in these campaigns we mentioned later. In 1814, in that 6-day campaign, he was more than willing to risk his Imperial Guard. So it is curious as to why he was so cautious at Borodino.
I do think because before Borodino, you had the capture of Minsk, and you had the Russians, if I remember correctly, because I got the book here on Napoleon's campaigns, or the biography of Napoleon, is that this is when the Russians basically started, they started torching fields, on the path of the French army, just to slow it down. Before of course, the famous sappers that destroyed Moscow. That's what's remembered. I do wonder if Napoleon was concerned, or it was eating away at him, the supply issues with his army. And because Borodino, I believe, it's quite deep within Russia itself.
Yes, it's right by Moscow.
It's right by Moscow. So he would have had to rely on the road from Minsk, which is hundreds of miles. And I think, especially in the Italian campaign, where when he took over command of the army in the Italian campaign, it was, it wasn't well equipped. It was lacking in supplies. It was lacking in a lot of resources, which he was able to turn around due to the post-revolutionary nature of the military at the time. So I think he was aware of the supply risk because I mean, let's be honest, one defeat there, the whole army could just be wiped out.
But on the other
Yeah.
hand, he then sat in Moscow for weeks, hoping against hope that the Tsar would come and talk to him. And of course, the Tsar didn't come and talk to him. And in the end, he had no option to retreat. But he'd left it too late.
I would argue some cost fallacy.
Yeah,
some cost fallacy. Yeah.
I mean, I think Napoleon what did at that point when in Moscow he went into total cope mode. Because when I think it was by his marshals that recorded when they saw the city on fire, he was absolutely like shook into his core. He couldn't believe it. So I think Napoleon was also a bit delusional at that point when it came to he thought that it would be symbolic enough that, like previous monarchs, this would be enough to sort of bend the Russian will and of the Tsar and the regime there. And of course, it didn't at all.
I think that a lot of his actions in Moscow and after Borodino, as they pertain to Russia, were there was certainly a lot of cope, but a lot of it was based on the fact that he had already beaten the Russians twice, and after he had beaten them in battle, first at Austerlitz and then at Friedland, it had allowed him to pursue peace talks. And of course, the whole Russian campaign up until Borodino had been a disaster. It started off pretty well because the initial plan, which everyone seems to forget, was to never go that far. It was to try and encircle Bagration and Barclay de Tolly, who had come way too far west before Smolensk. And the only reason this didn't happen was that one of his marshals was too slow and failed to encircle them, which allowed them to escape. And so at that point, it was like, we've either got to chase them or just give up everything. He finally managed to get to Borodino, and I guess, as you say, it was real hoping, possibly cope, that it would be the same as the previous campaigns, that I've beaten you, now let's talk. But of course, the Russians by that point had learnt their lesson. That
I will say one thing is Napoleon was kind of correct in saying, well, if he aims for Moscow, eventually the Russians would have to fight him, because that's what we did at Smolensk. Because Smolensk is I can't say the original phrase in Russian because it sounds weird in English, but it's literally called the shield of a motherland, because Smolensk has historically always shielded Moscow from Western invaders like Poland and all of it. So like with Smolensk, the Russians had to defend Moscow. They had to put in a defense simply because they could not, because at the very least, even if they were to lose, as they did, it's still, there's a famous painting of the Russian troops kneeling before Our Lady of Smolensk, which is a sacred icon, all about defending the motherland. That's kind of so on one hand, Napoleon, he was correct in thinking, okay, the Russians were going to have to fight, but even after the battle, I think it was like Marshal Ney, he remarked how could the Russians retreat in good order after the amount of excruciating losses they suffered, because the Russians, they lost Bagration as well as one of their main heads of artillery. So it goes to say that the Russians showed extreme resilience in fighting Napoleon, but Napoleon didn't really factor into his planning on Russia.
Yeah, and to highlight your point about the Russian suffering, I mean, even after they managed to push the French forces back across the Berezina River, the Niemen River, they then stopped. They didn't pursue Napoleon, and that allowed him to go back to Paris and reorganize his forces for what would become the campaign in Germany in 1813. And just to kind of answer the question that we had on the screen a minute ago, the reason why he didn't try to invade the UK was because of Trafalgar, many years before at that point.
And the Royal Navy in 1813 and 1814 and 1812, but also bear in mind, I mean, Naval Tricks is saying, could he make more ships? Yes, he could, and he did. although the Royal Navy used to capture them on a fairly regular basis. But he couldn't make more sailors, not more skilled sailors.
I mean,
because
the French
the French were
always
blockaded in port for the most part, and you can't become good sailors blockaded in port.
exactly that.
I mean,
the French, they learnt how to become sailors kind of in the classroom rather than at sea, and that meant that they were always outclassed. And then there's the fact that the Royal Navy would repeatedly commit raids on French ports. And then perhaps most importantly, though they were able to build these ships, and this was not just all of the ports that they had in France, but in Spain too, there was no way for them to sail these ships out of port and meet them together into a combined fleet without being intercepted.
No, exactly. It was as one famous British admiral said, "I do not say the French cannot come, I merely say they cannot come by sea." And of course, Britain is an island, and so it was physically impossible for Napoleon to get his troops to Britain, but he could march them into Russia. But the distances involved, and of course, Napoleon was neither the first nor the last person to think they could invade Russia. So,
sorry, go on.
I would just say that as a general point, the French Navy were known to recruit men as far inland as Dijon, which is not far from Switzerland. So that's the one thing that the French Navy, they didn't have the same rules as we do, where Royal Navy, they only recruit from seaside towns. So you won't see Royal Navy recruiting my neck of the woods in the West Midlands. You'll see them recruiting along the coastline.
Or in major ports, yeah. But I mean, also, of course, Britain had a much bigger merchant navy than the French. And your merchant navy in the Napoleonic era was basically where you were trying to get your skilled sailors from. Because sailing a first-rate ship of the line or a frigate is much the same as sailing a merchant ship, to be honest. And the gunnery you can teach people.
And, the thing I was going to quickly mention was just to remind everyone that he didn't intend on conquering or invading and conquering Russia. And this kind of links back to the topic at hand, which is that the reason why he invaded Russia was because Russia decided to stop agreeing to the continental system that was put in place precisely to try and cripple the United Kingdom.
And totally failed, of course, because it leaked everywhere. It leaked everywhere because the Europeans wanted the goods that the British were supplying them with. So,
I was just going to also say, sort of going back to the sort of end of the Napoleonic Wars and just that sort of brief period before Waterloo. Everyone sort of disbanded their forces, but one thing that was the legacy of that was that the expansion of the Royal Navy as this behemoth force had such an impact that an income tax was put on to pay for the upkeep and the maintenance of the Royal Navy.
The Royal Navy and the British Army, but yes.
Well, yeah, but the thing that was the most important thing, as you stated before, was in the mind was the Navy, with the army on the continent there, but we didn't have on the scale of France or Austria, Russia, Prussia.
The British Army was always a wholly professional, fairly small force. It was a very good force, but it was never a big conscript army as the French or the Russians or the Austrians, etc. had.
Yeah, and that one thing that going back to Waterloo is that with the British force, as you mentioned, you had the Dutch, you had the Hanoverian. It wasn't entirely a homogeneous British force in that sense. You did have other.
Yes, I did mention that.
And the problem that did occur was, of course, the language barrier, and And also, as you mentioned earlier as well, the loyalty of the Dutch troops, because of course,
Even there were even different drill systems in some of Wellington's troops. Like some of them used French-style drill, some used British-style drill. It was not a homogeneous army. It was heterogeneous, I should say. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I was just going to say Britain did have one slight advantage, and it was actually given to us by the Americans, because the War of 1812, which of course actually went on into 1814, meant that Britain had not demobilized as many troops and warships as she otherwise might have. Although, as I said, some of the troops were still in North America and hadn't got back in time to join the Waterloo campaign. But it did mean that Britain had not disbanded as many battalions as they normally would have, or even laid up as many warships in ordinary as they would have.
While I remember, this is just a passing comment. Today is also, the anniversary of Waterloo, but it's also the anniversary of James Madison, the President of the United States, declaring war against Britain in an attempt to conquest Upper and Lower Canada.
Well, we are certainly going to do a War of 1812 stream on this series at some point, but not today.
No, I just thought it's both. They fall on both dates, which I did not know until today.
Yeah, no, I did notice it somewhere actually, but we will certainly do a War of 1812 stream. A lot of people have asked me to do a War of 1812 stream, and we will at some point. But yeah, to get us back to our subject today, did anyone have anything to add about the difficulties Napoleon had in terms of some of his senior officers didn't want to come back to him? One or two of them had died, sometimes in somewhat mysterious circumstances. Also, I spoke briefly in my introduction that, Napoleon actually reorganized the French army very quickly. And it was certainly the best army he'd had since 1812 anyway. It was probably the best army he'd had, but it wasn't as well trained as the original Grand Army had been. I think that would be fair. But it was the best army. Yeah, but it was the best army he'd had since 1812. Since the original Grand Army was basically destroyed in Russia. So does anyone have anything to say about that? And then after that, I'm just going to talk briefly about Wellington and Blucher's forces. But if anyone's got anything to add to the French, go for it, guys.
I can't remember the precise details on the top of my head, but I remember there were two plans, like war plans, for marching to Belgium. There was a Mons plan, which apparently I think History March to the best later said they didn't fully believe that was the original plan because it wasn't as specific and precise as what became the later Charleroi plan. Because anyone who's watched the Napoleon film, for example, knows Napoleon did eventually march upon Charleroi, and because he took that route in order to get up to Brussels. So this is, I imagine this is where we start to detail how Wellington and Blucher responded to that march.
Anything from Jack or AOA in terms of the French side of things before we return to the Allied side?
I'd say I'd only highlight some of the marshals that were missing. Davout, interestingly, didn't actually fight in any of the campaigns with Napoleon at all after 1812, even though he was, by most accounts, his best marshal. He was locked up in Hamburg in 1813 and 1814 under siege. And in 1815, so during the 100 Days campaign, he was trusted to be in Paris to reorganize the army. So that was a big loss. Probably his second best had died at the Battle of Aspern, Aisling, and so he wasn't there. And probably the third kind of biggest loss was his chief of staff, Berthier.
Yeah.
who was also not present, and he was the real kind of brains behind all of the logistics and the administrative capacity of Napoleon's armies. And so it's one of those losses that is often overlooked, but shouldn't be understated.
Yeah, no, Berthier was absolutely vital, because Berthier was the guy who used to turn Napoleon's ideas and plans into practical orders.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was certainly a big loss. And so he had people like Grouchy, for example, who previously I think had mostly been a reserve cavalry commander.
Yeah, he was only promoted in, I think it was 1813. So he was a very, very recent marshal.
Yeah, and you know, to be fair, Napoleon always had a certain amount of problems with his marshals. They could be quite prickly, and they could be reluctant to cooperate with each other. I mean, one of the things that Wellington found in Spain was that the French marshals were often a little bit selfish about helping each other. So yeah.
And probably the best example is what was the name of the one who became king of Sweden?
Yeah, I know the one.
Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte.
Bernadotte, that's it. Yeah, I mean, he almost completely messed up the campaign in Prussia in 1806, the twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt.
And of course, he fought against Napoleon in 1813 or 14.
He did. So at Jena Auerstadt, the bulk of the Prussian army, so the French army was divided into its various corps, as was the way they did things. And Third Corps was out, which was Davout's corps, was out on the kind of far eastern flank of the Grande Armée, and they had false reports of where the Prussians were. And so Third Corps alone marched into basically the entirety of the Prussian army. And Davout asked Bernadotte for help, given that he was the closest other corps, and he basically refused, and almost got court-martialed by Napoleon for that. Luckily for Napoleon, Third Corps and Davout were capable enough that they were able to single-handedly beat the Prussians with just one corps. And then a similar sort of falling out happened at the Battle of Wagram in 1809, where Bernadotte was just refusing orders from Napoleon. And that was the breaking point. And at that point, he decided to leave Napoleon and become King of Sweden. He then refused to offer much help in the invasion of Russia, and then joined the coalition against him with the Swedish forces, and played a big part at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813.
And his descendants are still sitting on the Swedish throne to this day.
Yeah, you could argue that he played the game the best.
You could argue that. I mean, none of the other descendants of these people are still in senior positions. So yeah. And I mean, so many marshals ended up being kings of this, of that, and the other, and none of them lasted.
Yeah, I know with Bernadotte, he was, first of all, he went against Napoleon because I think Napoleon annexed Swedish Pomerania, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
That completely irked off the Swedes. Even though at this time the Swedish had a triple measure against the Russians over the Finnish War a few years before.
So what he did was he didn't take it. What he did was he negotiated to give it over to the Prussians as part of an agreement with them, and that obviously upset the Swedes quite a bit.
Yeah, and it's one of the things where it could have been an easy goal for him to get Sweden on board because Sweden was at war with Russia a few years before over Finland. Plus, I believe Bernadotte, he was the one who wrote up the Trachtenberg plan, which was used to defeat Napoleon. The whole point of the plan was everyone cooperates. The Austrians, they broke the plan for whatever reason, and they get smashed pretty hard. Safe of Leipzig, I can't remember the battle.
Dresden.
Yeah, Dresden was it. Yeah, just so yeah, Bernadotte is very much the linchpin of the Allies, with the exception of ourselves, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it was the Trachtenberg plan which I think really defeated Napoleon in 1813. In that, as I mentioned earlier, he won Lutzen and Bautzen just before they had that kind of ceasefire. And with the exception of Dresden, where the Austrians ignored the plan and attacked Napoleon, everyone else stuck to the plan and avoided attacking him directly and went for his marshals. And he didn't win a single battle for the remainder of that year, except for that really small skirmish when he was retreating from Leipzig.
Fair enough. Okay, guys, if people in the chat would like to look at the map we've got on the screen at the moment, this is going to show the theatre of operations for the 100 Days campaign. And you can see Charleroi on the border. You can see Brussels, which is what Napoleon was really aiming to get to. You can also see Ligny, which is where Napoleon defeated the Prussians. It was his last victory. And if you go slightly above Ligny, you can see Quatre Bras, which is where the British and Allied troops fought a smaller action, which I think you can justifiably call a draw.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you go further north towards Brussels, you'll see Waterloo. So that will give people just an idea of what we're talking about while we're talking about these battles.
So, I mean,
okay.
If you wanted us, we could go through a kind of some more in-depth detail on what the grand strategy by the French was with this campaign, especially because it gives an insight into how Napoleon fought.
Well, I mean, look, I'll give my brief look at it, Jack, and then you can tell me in more detail if you want to.
Go for it.
I mean, briefly speaking, what Napoleon needed to do was to defeat the Prussians and British separately, and he needed to do it quickly. If Blucher and Wellington combined forces, they were going to be too large for him to defeat, because his army was bigger than either of their armies on its own, but combined they had more men and more guns and more cavalry and what have you. So Napoleon's basic strategy was to defeat the British and the Prussians in detail, i.e. separately, and do so very quickly, because he knew that even if he won this campaign, he would then have to face the Russians and the Austrians and probably more Prussians and maybe more Brits. So he knew this was only going to be the start of the campaign, whatever happened. But to have any chance at all, he had to defeat Blucher, who was the Prussian commander, and Wellington, the British and Allied commander. That's my short overview, but you go for it, Jack.
Yeah, well, that's spot on. Every time you look at Napoleon's strategies in any of his campaigns where he's outnumbered, he tends to approach it the same, which is, as you say, it's just defeat in detail. I think the Italian campaign in 1796 is the best example of this. It's basically just the case of breaking up a larger force into spread apart armies and then defeating them within the vicinity a superior force. And so Quatre Bras, the whole point in that, as we say, ended in a stalemate, was pretty much just to prevent the British and the Prussians, who were at Ligny, from being able to combine their forces together so that Napoleon could defeat the Prussians at Ligny and then turn his focus onto the British.
Yeah, and he thought the harder of those two battles would be the Prussians, to be fair.
Yeah. And the reason he thought that was because he pretty much hadn't fought the British in any major battles in his career. He had fought the Prussians multiple times, had a very good record against them, but still held a lot of respect for them because, as we should all remember, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars only kicked off about a decade after Frederick the Great died. So Prussia still had a very strong military legacy at this point.
Yes, absolutely. And the Prussians had performed pretty well in 1813 and 1814. Although it is worth mentioning that although Marshal Blucher, the Prussian commander, he had a much more integrated army than Wellington had. And I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about Wellington's army later on. But Blucher's army was much more integrated because it was Prussian. He didn't have all of the best Prussian troops. He didn't, for example, have the Prussian Guard. He didn't have some of their heavy cavalry like cuirassiers and what have you. He had quite a few landwehr units, which were reservist units. So although the Prussian army was more integrated than the British army was, or the British and Allied army, it wasn't the best possible Prussian army, and reinforcements were still marching towards Blucher from Prussia. And again, this is another reason why Napoleon wants to beat them quickly, because they're going to get stronger. They're not going to get weaker. And then, and behind those forces, of course, you've got the big armies of Austria and Russia marching westward.
Now, on the battlefield to the French right, you had the village of what was it called? Oh bugger, I forgot the name here on my notes.
Hougoumont.
Actually, not. Yeah. Now that was defended. That was sort of like the defense against the Prussians. That was defended by Georges Morton. So that was where the Prussians would be would come from then.
I'm sorry, Aya.
Hello?
Yes? What you were saying?
Sorry, did you hear any of that?
Yes, you said you got as far as the Prussians were coming from.
Oh, right, sorry. I must have cut out then. Yeah, so the Prussians would have been coming from from Prition, and defending it was Georges Monton, who would then become Marshal of France, I think, later during the Restoration monarchy. Now, how well of a defense did he put up there? Like on the time scale wise?
The Prussians held out for a while. I think one of the things that you need to look at when you're looking at Napoleonic battles is not all of the troops could stand up to French infantry in close engagements. The Prussian landwehr, for example, were not probably going to stand up to the best French infantry in a close engagement. The British Army famously could and had done previously many times in the peninsula, but not everyone else could. And again, I don't want to get ahead of what I'm going to be talking about, because I want to talk a bit more about Wellington's army in a minute. But the Prussian forces, some of Blucher's men were a match for Napoleon's men, but not all of them were. As I said, he had quite a lot of reserve units and what have you.
Yeah, I was going to say the Battle for Ligny, where Napoleon defeats Blucher, the Prussians, I think it's about 16,000 casualties, whereas Napoleon got less than half of that, if I remember correctly. So Napoleon was able to quite handily deal with a lot of Prussian army in those days. And I don't know if you want to answer. I don't know how best to answer Nob. And they're saying why pursue Blucher. I mean, the thing about Blucher was everyone knew him to be very relentless. Like, the guy would never give up. So Napoleon was able to read that and sort of guess, okay, this is why he sent 30,000 men after Ligny under Grouchy and Gerard to pursue Blucher to prevent them meeting up.
But the trouble with Grouchy going on to pursue, or Napoleon ordering him to pursue the Prussians, that because of the lateness of his start, he actually didn't. Grouchy didn't actually know the direction that the Prussians had taken.
Yeah, he moved pretty slowly.
Yeah, I think it's something like Blucher could manage 10 miles in a day or something like that, whereas Grouchy could only do 6, so they was never going to capture plus. I believe because they didn't know where, because Blucher originally set out from Namur onto Ligny, and you had Gneisenau who was telling Blucher, well, why don't we just go back to Namur, because we need to get back home, because if we get trapped in Belgium and our army is obliterated, there's nothing to stop Napoleon from crossing the Rhineland at a later point after conquering Belgium. However, Gneisenau, he obeys Blucher. Like, he's very loyal subordinate in that he orders army to continue. I think up to Wavre, I think it was. I mean, from Wavre.
Yes. It was.
Yeah.
Blucher, by the way, was known as Marshal Vorwärts because he was always saying forward. And even at the Battle of Ligny, and he was like 70 years old at this stage, he was shot off his horse and ridden over by a cavalry charge. He was quite a tough old boy. And also quite strange. He at one stage thought he was pregnant with an elephant. But
he also had an atrociously bad record against Napoleon.
Yes, he had been beaten many times, true, and still kept attacking. But he was a man of his word, and he gave Wellington his word that he would support him with at least a couple of divisions if he made a stand.
This does raise a point. We were speaking about the French high command, if you will, and their changing of staff. The same thing happened with the Prussians. A lot of their veterans, like Brunswick and Scharnhorst, and that were no longer in the game. And men like Blucher he was an older veteran, but he was never the one who was really commanding in the earlier years for Prussia, and certainly not under Frederick. So it is worth noting that the Prussians, as well as the French, had quite a heavy change in who was commanding the various forces.
For sure. It's also worth mentioning that the French had a very powerful artillery force. Of course, Napoleon himself was an artillery officer. And they had a very powerful artillery force in the 100 Days campaign, as the British were going to find out at Waterloo. But that was also very useful to Napoleon at Ligny, because he had more guns and heavier guns than Blucher had. And he also had a better cavalry force than Blucher as well, to be honest. At the same time as Ligny was being fought, the Brits and their allies were fighting at Quatre Bras. And this was a smaller scale action. And it started off with the French having a big numerical advantage. And this was under Marshal Ney. Now, a lot of people think Marshal Ney got some sort of PTSD when he was in Russia. You know, what people would have said was shell shock in World War I or something. And a lot of people suspect that. And certainly some of his actions are at Quatre Bras and also at Waterloo were quite strange. Like at Quatre Bras, he's riding around shouting out, "Has nobody got a bullet for me?" You know, I mean, this is not something you want your general to be shouting, to be honest. He started off with more troops than Wellington had at Quatre Bras, and particularly Wellington only had Dutch Belgian troops there initially. But these guys actually did quite well, and they managed to hold on until increasing numbers of British reinforcements marched up to them. But subsequently, of course, Wellington gets a message that Blucher's lost at Ligny and he's going to have to fall back. And as a result, he's got to fall back too. But he did have Blucher's word that at least a couple of Prussian divisions would come and reinforce him. If he hadn't had that, Wellington's opinion of his army, of his own army, was rightly very low, and he didn't think he should fight Napoleon on its own.
Yeah, I would.
Sorry, you carry on.
Sure thing. So I don't know if Wellington knew this, but I know Napoleon often commented that with Blucher, he was very relentless, very stubborn old goat of a man. So Wellington probably knew that about him. Probably thought, okay, he's going to stay in Belgium too, because Blucher very aggressive. Apparently, I don't know. I mean, Jack is probably the best place to know. I read somewhere that Blucher's plan was he was going to stay in Belgium even if Wellington was falling back. Like, even if Wellington withdrew from Belgium altogether, Blucher would still stay and fight another battle, even if it resulted in another massive defeat, like at least what he can do.
Yeah, Blucher didn't like to retreat, that's for sure.
Very
In
much.
the 1814 campaign, the main thrust into France across the Rhine was an army that was split into two. One of them, the larger part of the army, was commanded by the Austrian commander Schwarzenberg, and the other part of the coalition army was commanded by Blucher. And repeatedly, he was trying to advance along the north and was repeatedly, as I mentioned, beaten by Napoleon. And every single time he had to retreat, it was like he took that personally. Certainly, I don't think he'd forgotten by the 1815 campaign.
Okay, so you end up with the Allied, with the Prussian army defeated and retreating, but retreating in a direction that enabled them to stay in touch at a distance with Wellington's forces. And Wellington had noted the Waterloo position sometime prior to this and knew it was a good defensive position. And you can say many things about the Duke of Wellington, but he was a master at selecting ground, and he could see that the position at Mont Saint Jean at Waterloo was a very good defensive position that was going to give his heterogeneous army a very good position to try and hold. It was going to be difficult to turn, but he was extremely worried about his right flank. That's to say his right, which would be Napoleon's left. Because had Napoleon tried to outflank him on the left, he could have cut him off from the sea. And no British army wants to be cut off from the sea for obvious reasons. Because if you get into trouble, the Royal Navy can't rescue you, basically.
Is this the bit in the Waterloo film where Napoleon says about Wellington? Obviously, he's not a student of Caesar, with his force with the backing. Their backs to the forests.
But it was actually a forest that you could drive artillery through, as Wellington pointed out. It was a forest, yes, but the trees were quite a long way apart. You could drive batteries of artillery through it. It wasn't such a barrier as Napoleon thought it was. And Wellington, as I said, had personally inspected this position sometime before.
I mean, that's another thing. The battlefield itself, before, there was quite a substantial bit of rain, so there was an incredible amount of mud. There was, yes, and we'll get on to that for sure. Yeah, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about Wellington's army because it was a very mixed force. As I said, he had a lot of Dutch-Belgian troops. And they didn't even like each other, never known and other things. Like the Belgians weren't desperately keen to be part of Holland, to be honest, as was proven later. That is true because the Nassau regiment didn't really trust the Dutch and vice versa because of course some even accuse them saying that as soon as the battle would commence, they would just switch. They would just switch and join Napoleon.
Well, yeah, I was just going to come on to the fact that then he had his Brunswick forces, which varied. Some of them were reasonable and some of them weren't. And the same is true of his Hanoverian troops from Hanover itself. Again, that had been occupied by the French for years. And the Hanoverian officers who had recent military experience had been fighting for the French. This is nothing to do with the King's German Legion. The King's German Legion, which was originally recruited in Hanover, which of course was a principality that George III ruled, the King's German Legion was an integral part of the British Army and had fought all through the Peninsular War and were very, very good soldiers, at least as good as the best in the British Army.
Because I think on the morning of the battle, or something like Napoleon, he just kept dismissing Wellington's army because I think that Soult and others were telling Napoleon, look, Wellington's quite a capable general. He's known.
Well, he'd beaten all these guys in Spain, of course, including Soult. So Wellington had beaten every French marshal sent to Spain and Portugal.
Yeah.
None of them were not defeated fighting Wellington's forces. He had a lot of experience, and his officers and men also had a lot of confidence as a result of this, because, you know, ever since 1808 at least, the British Army had been winning when they'd been fighting the French. I mean, yes, they had the occasional setback, they lost the occasional skirmish, but they didn't lose major battles. Largely because Wellington picked his ground very well. And also, you know, not all of Wellington's victories were defensive either. If you look at Salamanca, for example.
Well, Salamanca is the one example.
Well, it's not the only one. It's not the only one.
As in, it's like the major, you know.
Well, it's the one occasion when he had enough troops that he was able to do that. I mean, bear in mind, he was mostly outnumbered. So,
and was it Marmont? I think it was Marshal Marmont he was against. Decided to quite bizarrely turn and reorganize his entire army right in front of Wellington, which made it quite easy for him to just march forward and get onto the French flank.
Yeah, I think
military theorist also correctly points out Vittoria, which was also an attacking victory.
Was it Salamanca or Vittoria where it's like Marmont thought Wellington was retreating?
Yes,
and just made so many.
Yeah, that was Salamanca, I think. But they were, both armies were trying to get around each other's flank, and Marmont extended too far, and he left a gap, and Wellington saw it immediately.
This is a small comment. I mean, you know, Edward Pakenham about Salamanca. I mean, he's like you could trust him with like a brigade or something, but he's kind of like Marshal Ney in the sense of you couldn't really trust him with a strategic. Like I say, in strategic sense, like you can trust him with an army corps, because what happened at New Orleans where he got beaten by Andrew Jackson before him.
Yes, attacking a position frontally, which, like, had Wellington been there, he wouldn't have dreamed of attacking in that way. But yeah, it's you know, you get good, brave commanders who will carry out their orders very well, but when they're required to think for themselves, they can't, or they're not very good at it. And that's just what happens in war. It still does. But yeah, it's Wellington's army was extremely mixed in quality, and like Wellington had set up a corps organization similar to the French, but he had to abandon it because had he kept it up, he wouldn't have been able to corset his allied soldiers with British and King's German Legion troops, which is what he needed to do. He needed to put the brigades of the British Army and the King's German Legion in the most vital positions and in the front of his formations. And he needed to make sure that there were good, reliable British and King German Legion formations in between his far less reliable and far less experienced allied troops. So, you know, you will get people saying, oh, the British Army at Waterloo was only a quarter British, I've heard people say, which is not true. It was actually over a third British, but anyway. And it was more than that if you add in the King's German Legion. But
I mean,
Wellington managed to organize his forces so that he had good, reliable troops in between his less reliable troops, which is something not many generals would have been able to organize, to be honest. But to do so, he had to get rid of the corps organization totally, which was probably a good thing, since one of the corps commanders was the Prince of Orange, who was an idiot and not experienced. But he had to get rid of not only his corps organization, he really had to largely get rid of his divisional organization as well.
Now, the Prince of Orange's promotion for the battle and command was mostly, well, if not entirely political. That was between the two governments of the Netherlands and Britain. You know, the reason why he was given a higher command than before. Where did the Prince of Orange serve in the Was it there was Peninsular War, wasn't it?
Yeah, he had served on the staff in the Peninsular War, but he'd never really commanded any troops.
Yeah, that was a bit of a controversial. I remember in Sharp, wasn't he like a sort of a villainous character or something?
Oh yeah, in
Sharp,
Sharp, but you can't always believe Sharp as a history. But yes, but he wasn't well respected in the British Army.
No. Oh,
Oh,
I think we lost Andrew. While we waited a sec, because of course he was wounded in action, and in Sharp, it sort of retconned into Sharp that he was actually wounded by Sharp when he shot him at distance out of frustration.
But whilst we're waiting for Andrew to address one of the points he raised, one of the reasons why Napoleon didn't attack Wellington's western flank, should we put it to be simple, was precisely because he wanted to keep himself between the British and the Prussian forces. His whole idea was to ensure that there was a wedge so that they couldn't reinforce each other. Hello, Andrew.
Yeah, sorry, my computer decided it wanted to crash for a second there. I beg your pardon. But yeah, you're quite correct, Jack, that Wellington was extremely worried about his right flank, which is to say the flank nearest the sea. And as you say, Napoleon didn't attack him in that direction because he couldn't really afford to. He needed to still be able to defend against the Prussians. But he also wanted to destroy Wellington's army and thought that he would be able to do so relatively easily because, as you correctly said earlier, he basically hadn't fought the British. He'd fought some skirmishes against Sir John Moore's troops in 1806, 1807, but that was about the only time. And of course, very early in his career, he'd fought against the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines at Toulon. But again, the only time he'd done so, really.
Yeah, certainly no major battles against the British.
Yeah, and Napoleon was nothing if not a bit of an egotist, and he no doubt thought that, well, okay, Wellington defeated all my subordinates, but that doesn't mean he's a good general, So, and I think undoubtedly that Napoleon underrated the British troops for sure, but he also did know that Wellington did have an infamous army, and that it was a hodgepodge, and whilst he had some good elements, the British Guards were there, their household cavalry were there, but again, neither of those units were desperately experienced, although you couldn't criticize their discipline and training. But he had no great idea that Wellington was an extraordinarily good general, and in particular, an extraordinarily good general if he could fight on ground of his own choosing.
So I'm just looking at I've been having a look at the breakdown of Wellington's army and the French army as well, the army of the North. And this is excluding Blucher's army, so they're not including this. But Wellington's army was numbered at 68,000. 31,000 were of the British regiments. That's including the King's German Legion. You had 17,000 from the Netherlands, 11,000 from Hanover. You had 6,000 from Brunswick, and then you had 3,000 from the Duchy of Nassau, which is again fell within the Netherlands, but it was a separate, but within that framework, and 156 guns.
Yes, he had less artillery than Napoleon. He had a smaller army than Napoleon, not much smaller, but a bit smaller. And he had fewer cavalry. Although, as I said earlier, Although, as I said earlier, this was the one battle that Wellington fought where he had a reasonable cavalry force, because he never had enough cavalry in the peninsula.
Yeah, I mean, he had. I mean, the infantry was about 48 to 50,000, and the cavalry is, again, 14,500 to 15,000, so which is quite a substantial number,
Yes.
compared to his previous campaigns, as you mentioned, and he had 252 guns.
I think you might
As
find
well.
that's 100. I think you might find that's 152. Oh, you mean Napoleon had 200?
Napoleon had
Yeah,
252 guns. Yeah.
Napoleon had a lot more artillery. It was also heavier artillery. Like Napoleon had quite a lot of 12-pounder field pieces. The French mainly used 8 and 12-pounder field pieces and howitzers, of course. Whereas the British Army used 6 and 9-pounders and howitzers. So French artillery tended to be a bit heavier as well, and a heavier gun gave you longer range. Also, it's worth pointing out that a first-rate ship of the line, like HMS Victory, for example, had almost as much, well, it probably had more firepower than all of Wellington's guns at Waterloo. One ship. Because a first-rate ship of the line like HMS Victory would have 32-pounders on the lower deck. It would have 24-pounders on the middle deck and 18-pounders on the top deck, sometimes 12-pounders, and plus carronades and what have you. So one ship like HMS Victory had more firepower than Wellington did in terms of artillery.
I mean, just to also add, Blucher's army was numbered about 50,000. He had 126 guns.
Yep. He also had a fair amount of cavalry. What the Allies didn't have a lot of was heavy cavalry. So Napoleon had his famous cuirassiers and also dragoons and what have you.
Sorry. What about the Polish cavalry?
Lancers.
I think he only had one squadron of Polish lancers at Waterloo. I think it was one squadron.
They're famous because they end up playing a big role.
Yeah, and they were brigaded with the Dutch lancers, who by this time were probably French anyway, to be honest. The
Batavian,
Polish, I can never remember. I think it was the Polish lancers who wore red and the Dutch lancers who wore blue, but it might have been the other way around.
It was the other way, yeah.
Yeah, I think they wore blue. The only reason I remember that is there's one of the Polish revolts against the Russian Empire. They one of the colours that they favoured for their uniforms, I guess was blue. It was sort of like harking back to the those units, sort of. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Okay, let's start going through a few of our illustrations at this stage. And this is the Duke of Wellington and his staff, and it's actually a painting showing the end of the battle, because the Prince of Orange is wounded in the lower left-hand corner. But that's Wellington and his staff, and Wellington's staff at Waterloo was shot to ribbons. He lost so many of them. How Wellington himself was not shot is incredible, because he was constantly moving during the battle to the most vital points of the battle, and he was always under French artillery fire, and quite frequently under French musket fire, and fairly frequently had to take shelter in squares for French cavalry and what have you. So he had a bit of a charmed life at Waterloo.
The Earl of Uxbridge was wounded.
Uxbridge, by the way, is in the picture is the Hussar guy on the right at the front. That's Uxbridge, I believe. And Uxbridge and Wellington didn't get on very well, because Uxbridge had eloped with his sister-in-law.
And Thomas Picton was killed, and more notable figures that was killed at Waterloo. And as I mentioned when
Yes.
you went offline briefly, the Prince of Orange was also wounded. He wasn't wounded by Sharp, though I don't know if he was wounded by Green Jackets. I
Yeah, no,
assume, I
he's in
assume
this
he was
picture
wounded.
wounded. Yeah,
Yeah, he's in the
this
picture wounded.
on the left.
Yeah,
with
on
the
the left.
braided
Yeah,
with the
yes.
braided police on. Yeah, Uxbridge was also the overall Allied cavalry commander and Wellington's second in command. Although Wellington didn't really tell him anything, because as he said to Uxbridge, it all depends on what the French do. So, yeah.
Uxbridge during the battle had his leg blown off, and he had to have it
Towards-
amputated.
Yeah, towards the end of it, actually.
And his amputation was notable because as they did the whole procedure, his heart rate stayed exactly the same throughout.
Yeah, he was a pretty steady chap.
Yeah.
The other chap who lost an arm at Waterloo was Wellington's aide-de-camp Raglan, who later was the British commander in the Crimea. He lost his arm at Waterloo, and after the surgeons cut it off, he asked them to bring it back because there was a ring that his wife had given him on one of the fingers that he wanted to keep. They were quite tough back in those days.
Yeah, I know Wellington after this battle, I think this was the second time in his life he was recorded to have wept because so many of his guys had died. The other time he actually did cry in public was on a procedure by the Hof, where he lost 2,500 men at the breach.
Yeah. He lacked a decent siege train at the time, a siege train of heavy siege artillery and what have you. And he was always short of engineers and sappers and miners, and so he had to order these assaults before the breaches were really fully practical, and he lost a lot of men. He captured the town, but it was very expensive, and Wellington was seen in tears, which is something you would never see Napoleon doing about his top soldiers at all. Anyway, this illustration is Marshal Blucher. Old Marshal Forward's himself on his horse. He's the central figure there. And then we also have, of course, Napoleon wearing his favorite undress chasseur's uniform under a greatcoat.
He was also
not looking very happy, I have to say. Sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, also, like in the film, he was suffering as well the early stages of stomach cancer.
Yeah.
And he was suffering spouts of pain. One of the reasons why he left the battlefield, or he had moments where he had to be, he was secluded and all that, to get around it. But if a lot of the paintings at the time and everything, they did say that he seemed a bit, withdrawn. I think it's quite well depicted in the film, actually. One thing I do like about the film is like he seems tired and withdrawn, and that very much seems to be some of it. He doesn't have that sort of energy, even though he puts it on in some occasions. But publicly, he puts on that face. But he does seem quite well. I mean, when did he die? It was 1821.
Round about then.
6 years later, something like that. Yeah.
I've also heard he had piles, which would have been agony if you were having to ride a horse.
Ugh.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, let's go back to our maps. And this is Waterloo, early on in the battle, with the British being to the north at the top and the French to the south at the bottom. British are in red and the French are in blue, and it uses the conventional blocks for infantry units and crossed things for cavalry.
I do wonder what happened to the farmers in the farmhouses between. I'm assuming they just sort of like scarpered when the
I would
arrived.
imagine they scarpered. Yes, why would
they
you?
Probably would have scarpered to a reasonable distance and then watched. It was very common for locals to watch battles in those days.
I mean, you've only you've only got to go a couple of miles back, and you're pretty safe in terms of the weapons. I mean, I suppose we should talk about that very briefly. Like a 12-pounder field gun might go maybe 1,200 yards, maybe, but only in direct line of sight, and it's firing a solid iron cannonball. They don't explode. They bounce along, and everything they hit, they'll take your arms off or smash you to pieces if you're close enough. Even a rolling cannonball was powerful enough that if sometimes you get an inexperienced soldier who would put his foot out to stop it, and he'd take his foot off. This was quite common. They also had shells, but these were mostly fired by howitzers, which are shorter barreled guns that can fire high angle. And the Brits had an advantage there because they had shrapnel shells, which were actually full of musket balls. So when they exploded, they were much more deadly than the normal shell, which just had pieces of shell plus gunpowder, basically.
How effective was it though? Because the British had a higher position than the French, or what I should say is the French had to advance upwards effectively to the British position. Now, the artillery, the guns, how effective would that have been in reality? Because it can't.
Well, it's going to be less effective because Wellington always will get it when he can. Will use a reverse slope position, and he will also get his troops to lie down when they're not immediately having to confront the enemy, because that's going to lessen their casualties. So it is going to be less effective. But you also have to understand that the French artillery and the British artillery are doing two different jobs. Wellington would not let his gunners fight duels with the French gunners. He wouldn't let them do it. The British artillery was basically, because it was smaller and fewer in number, it was there as close support artillery for his infantry. That's what his job was. The British artillery was aiming to kill the French infantry and cavalry as they came up to the British position. The French artillery was bombarding the whole British position. Napoleon, as he normally did, had formed a grand battery of artillery, and as I say, it included these big 12-pounder guns, some of them. And yeah, they were going to do a lot of damage. I mean, I think it was the Enniskillens hardly fought French infantry all day, and yet they had the heaviest casualties of any British unit. And you could see where their square was that they'd formed against the French cavalry from the dead guys.
And this leads back to what the farm statement I have, because the farm was it the Hougoumont? That was the name of the farm.
Hougoumont. Yes,
yeah.
Hougoumont and La Haye-Saint, and there was another one on his other flank which doesn't get mentioned much because the French didn't attack there very much. But these were vital bastion positions in front of his line.
Yeah. Now he took the decision because they were occupied by the Hanoverian and the Nassau regiment, the guards and regiments.
La Haye-Saint was occupied by those guys. Hougoumont was occupied by the British Foot Guards mostly, the light companies of the British Foot Guards.
Oh, okay. So, and then the Coldstream Guards and the Scots Guards arrived to support the defence.
Yeah, although they weren't yet called that. They were the first guards, second guards, what have you. But I just wanted to say a little bit about musketry. The French and British muskets were quite similar. You couldn't fire British musket balls out of French muskets, but you could fire French musket balls out of British muskets, strange to say, because the British ones were a bit bigger. And they had an effective range at most of about 150 yards. And really, it was under 100 when you were going to do real execution with them. So that's how far you can fire these things. And you fire them in volleys because they're not terribly accurate. So you fire company volleys, platoon volleys, sometimes ranked volleys in the French army. But usually in the British Army, it was platoon volleys of about 30 or so guys. And it would run up and down the battalion constantly. And you could, if you were a good, well-trained soldier like the Brits were, you might fire 3 rounds a minute. But that would be that's your maximum rate of fire. It's also worth mentioning in terms of the artillery that they could also fire canister. And canister basically turned the artillery piece into a gigantic shotgun. It was like a very thin, usually tin, literally tin, full of musket balls. And you could fire that, but it had fairly short range. Again, 150, 200 meters maximum range, but it was bloody deadly against close order troops. And because your weapons are not very accurate in terms of muskets, the infantry have to fight shoulder to shoulder in close order. The Brits, again, had a bit of an advantage because the Brits, starting in America, actually, during the American War of Independence, had begun to operate in a 2-deep line rather than a 3-deep line. And this meant that if you're firing solid iron cannonballs at people, or musket balls, you're going to hit less people if there's only 2 in the rank rather than 3. And it also means you fewer men can outflank more of the enemy. If the French, for example, who like to advance in column quite often, and then they were supposed to deploy into line, but that was quite difficult to do under fire. But the French would advance in a column that was deeper than it was wide, or at least a lot deeper than 2 ranks. It might be 8, 16 ranks deep sometimes. Whereas the British were in a 2-deep line. Now, obviously, if you've got, say, 500 troops in a 2-rank line, that is 250 men wide, whereas your French force of the same size would be far narrower, which means the British can outflank you. And people who read the Sharp books or watch the Sharp TV series will hear people talking about firing 3 rounds a minute, which they could. But the number of times when troops stood at close range and exchanged loads of volleys was quite rare. It had always been quite rare. In the Peninsula, for example, the normal British tactic was to fire 1 or 2 volleys, give a cheer, and then do a bayonet charge, which would chuck the French off the hill, almost always. It wasn't a prolonged match between 2 sides volleying away at each other. That did happen, but it wasn't that common. The other thing is that cavalry were not much of a threat to steady infantry in a square. If infantry were well trained and steady, they weren't going to run away. You can't make a horse charge into a solid square of bayonets. You just can't do it. Horse is a living animal, it's not a machine. And on the rare occasions when squares were broken by cavalry, and it did happen, it was occasionally done by lancers because they had a longer reach, but more often it was something like a horse would get shot while charging and would skid into the square and make a gap, which if the infantry didn't fill that gap in quickly enough would allow the cavalry to get inside.
Yes, it took a real elite horseman to do it intentionally. The Battle of Eylau, this did happen. That was one of the largest cavalry charges in history in that battle against the Russians by the French. And Bessières, who was Napoleon's kind of commander of the Imperial Guard cavalry, was brought up. And they found themselves surrounded at one point, and the only way to get out was to charge directly through a square, and they successfully did so. But the casualty rates were absolutely immense.
Yes. And again, Napoleon would also sometimes use his reserve cavalry, his heavy cavalry, to attack infantry positions in the center of the enemy. And I think that's possibly something to do with what happens at Waterloo, but we'll talk about that in a minute when we get more onto the battle itself. But anyway, the positions to note here is you've got Hougoumont over here, if people can see my cursor, and La Haye-Saint is here, and then there's another couple of farmhouses over here, which don't really matter because the French don't really attack them. But what that means is the French have got to capture Hougoumont before they could really effectively attack Wellington's right. And La Haye Saint is a bastion in his centre, which is going to mean the French forces trying to attack his line up on the heights here on the hill. And they weren't high hills, by the way. These are quite low hills. The French forces trying to attack Wellington's line are going to be channeled by these defensive positions. And of course, the troops in them had loopholed the walls, put farm wagons and things in the gates to block them, and turned them into quite good defensive positions.
And they had light infantry in the orchards outside.
He did indeed, and the rifle brigade were also on this road here near La Haye Saint as well. The famous Green Jackets.
And the French in this first case as well on the farms, they had tree cover. The infantry had tree cover as well, or briefly.
Oh yeah, and there were orchards around Hougoumont, for example, and woods.
Yeah, because
it was a chateau. La Haye Saint was a average farm really, but Hougoumont was a small chateau. It's also worth mentioning the British had another slight advantage against the French in that we had the Rifle Brigade and also the King's Royal Rifle Corps, the 60th. And these guys were armed with Baker rifles. Now, these were still muzzle loaders like the musket, but they were rifled, which made them more accurate and longer ranged. And you could, a Baker rifle's extreme range was probably about 300 yards, 250 really, practically. But that's still quite a lot longer than a musket. It was a bit slower to load. So you probably only fire 2 rounds a minute rather than 3. But it meant you could pick off officers and NCOs and people like this before they came into effective range. And one of Napoleon's things was when he took over as emperor, he got rid of rifles from the French army. He didn't think they were worth having.
But the French, they did have very, very few anyway.
Yeah, but they had some initially, and the ones they had, Napoleon got rid of for reasons best known to himself. But the French usually, probably. The French also normally preceded their attacks with clouds of skirmishers. And in the peninsula, Wellington had realized this, and he countered them. Because British infantry battalions had 10 companies. They had 8 line companies and 2 flank companies. And one was a grenadier company, which was usually the tallest guys in the regiment, biggest guys in the regiment. And they were often guys who would lead assaults and stuff. They didn't use grenades by this time much. They were an 18th century thing. But your other flank company was the light company. The light company was trained in skirmishing. And every battalion had a light company. But the British also had some light infantry battalions who were all trained in skirmishing. And then you had the Green Jackets, the Rifles, and the King's Royal Rifle Corps, who again were trained in skirmishing. Although all of these units could also fight in line. But they were especially trained in skirmishing. And that meant that Wellington could put his own skirmishers in front of his line and counter the French skirmishers, which meant that they didn't get the advantage that the French originally got when they went up to line infantry. And these skirmishers were able to pepper them with skirmishing fire. And they were hardly worth firing volleys at. And they were too dispersed to kill very easily with volleys. But that tactic didn't really work against Wellington and the British Army.
Now, at Hougoumont as well, it's worth saying that a general was quite quickly killed during this attack on the French side. So this is Pierre-Francois Bourdon and his brigade, which led the assault. And I believe he was taken out by artillery.
The picture on the screen. The picture on the screen at the moment, AI, is fighting outside Hougoumont.
Yeah. And so that was and they were the ones that would disperse from the woods and everything. And Apparently, there's also there's a separate thing because it was the start of the actual the battle had commenced for Waterloo. There is several records which claim different times the battle took place. So between apparently 10 o'clock and 11:30 in the morning, there's sources that don't really record that there's a sort of a contradiction between the time what the time was.
Yeah,
But
there always is in battles in these days. I mean, as you said earlier, AI, it's also worth mentioning it pissed down with rain all night before the Battle of Waterloo. And that was actually, although it gave everybody a horrible, uncomfortable night, because of course they had no tents or anything like this, it did actually advantage the British the next day, because Napoleon had to wait for a couple of hours for the ground to dry out a bit so he could get his artillery in position.
Yep.
Yeah. Now the second attack was by the Sawyer's Brigade, which reached the north gate of the house, and it was Lieutenant Legros, who was a French officer. Now we've seen it in film and art, but he was like the one with the big axe who.
Yeah, I've got an illustration for this coming up in a minute. I think it's worth on a slightly more tactical note. It's worth pointing out. I think it was d'Erlon's division which originally attacked Hougoumont.
Yes.
And of course, there were far fewer than a division's worth of British troops in it. It was the light companies of the Guards for the most part. And Wellington did reinforce it during the day, but he reinforced it with companies, whereas d'Erlon's division attacks Hougoumont, and quite quickly the other division in that corps also gets dragged into this fight. So a lot more Frenchmen are attacking Hougoumont than British soldiers are holding it, which is, all good from the British point of view.
And also the French are having a high turnaround of their officers being killed, like really high ranking officers being killed in this as well.
Yes.
More so than the British at this point.
This is an illustration, by the way, of the thing that AI was just talking about, where the French break in the gate with the axe, and something like a dozen or maybe 18 Frenchmen managed to get in before the guardsmen managed to shut the gate. And the guardsmen then go around and bayonet all of the Frenchmen who got in, except for one little drummer boy who a guardsman sat on until the fighting had stopped.
Yeah, was he still like 12 or something? I think
he was just a kid, and the guardsmen didn't have the heart to kill him. So someone sat on him until the French had all been killed and he could be sent into the buildings. The French artillery, by the way, also set the buildings on fire.
What was the British position on like drummer boys at that time if they're captured? Would they actually kill like the French drummer boys, or would they be like
no. Normally you look, anyone could get taken prisoner, but in any war, whether it be modern or in 1815, you've got to be careful when you're trying to surrender to the enemy. And the British were in a desperate position in Hougoumont. So the French guys who'd managed to break in, and had the French captured the place, they would have bayoneted a lot of the British soldiers. So the Frenchmen who broke in didn't last long, but they just didn't have the heart to kill this kid who was a drummer boy. So they didn't.
Well, yeah, it probably posed no threat, to be honest, probably a tiny little thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, Hougoumont does exactly what Wellington wants it to do. It drags in a lot of French troops and means that at least 2 divisions of French infantry are not really available to attack his line because they're busy attacking this place.
I've got a quote from Wellington on the battle. And he got it here. Says, I had occupied the post with a detachment from General Byng's brigade of guards, which was in position in its rear, and it was some time under the command of Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald and afterwards Colonel Home, and I am happy to add that it was maintained throughout the day with the utmost gallantry by these brave troops, notwithstanding the repeated efforts of large bodies of the enemy to obtain possession of it.
Yep, sounds fair enough. This illustration is La Haye Saint, by the way, from the French point of view. And La Haye Saint was being held by the King's German Legion. And the King's German Legion, their light companies used rifles. Unlike most British light companies who used a musket, the King's German Legion light companies used a rifle. And also the rifle brigade were fighting outside. And the Baker rifle used a different ball to the musket, and they weren't interchangeable, which will become important later on. Does Jack or Mitch have anything to say on this stuff?
Well, I'll mention that we were wondering which corps was attacking which farmhouse. La Haye Saint was the one in the centre, so it would have been that one that was attacked by d'Erlon's corps, not Hougoumont.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I'm sorry,
but just a minor kind of thing that I've only just figured out. But it's easy to get the farmhouses mixed up.
It is. Indeed.
I mean, also between the assaults of the farmhouses, like this is only a matter of like, well, according to Lord Hill, there's like 20 minutes. You had the battery bombardment from Napoleon had started, so there was that period of just along the line of just Napoleon's artillery bombarding, the positions in front of them, and then you had then the attack at
Hougoumont was the first to be attacked.
Yeah, Hougoumont was the first attack, and then La Haye was the second attack. Or, I mean, technically that's considered the first French infantry attack, but yeah, sure.
Mitch, did you have anything you wanted to say about this at the moment?
No, I was going to mention my drum against Spare, but yeah, you already mentioned. I always remember because
it was actually Real who attacked Hougoumont first. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, I always forget whether which flank Hougoumont was on. But I know like La Haye Saint was on the centre because, as evidence of the film, like Napoleon believed that taking La Haye Saint would be the main deciding factor of the battle, and because it was in the centre, and of course, the fighting was good. I clued up on this aspect of the battle as much, other than what has already been said.
Hougoumont was on the kind of more western side of the battle, so that would have been on the right of the British side, on the left of the French.
Let's put one of our maps up.
And La Haye Saint was, I believe, it was on a main road.
Yes,
or not on.
was.
It was actually on a road, unlike Hougoumont. So
it was on a road, and also there was a sunken road which ran behind it.
Yeah. And ironically, the farmhouses still stand to this day.
Oh yeah, you can go and visit them. I've been there. You can do that.
Yeah, it's by the standards of historic battlefields, Waterloo is one of the better ones to go to because they have quite a lot there for it. Big panorama.
Apart from the horrible mound, yes.
Yes, and that big mound.
Oh, the man-made hill.
Yes.
Yeah.
The one that made Wellington say they have ruined my battlefield. This is the second map of Waterloo that is a bit later on in the day. And you can see, again, if you can see my cursor, that's Hougoumont there, and that's La Haye Saint there. If people can see my cursor.
Yeah, that must be much later in the battle because you can see.
Yeah, it is a bit late.
Cavalry charge.
I've got three maps for Waterloo. And this is the second one, and it's when the French are organizing their cavalry charges and what have you. But anyway, we shall go back to our illustrations. And this is La Haye Saint from the French point of view. And as you can see, it's got quite formidable walls and what have you.
It's much smaller, La Haye Saint.
Yes, it is. It's a farmhouse rather than a chateau. So yeah, it is much smaller. And as I said, it's held by the King's German Legion. And it is important that their light companies do not use Brown Bess muskets. They use Baker rifles, which is quite useful for them. But in the end, becomes quite important for the battle.
During during the assault, wasn't it also, because this is like we're getting to 1 o'clock in the afternoon? This was at the time where, or roughly at the same time, Napoleon spots the Prussians about 4 or 5 miles out.
It's late. No, it's later than that, actually.
Is it later than that? Okay.
Yeah, it's a 2:30 or something. I think the Prussians are first seen, and they're quite a way off, and there aren't many of them. But anyway, we haven't got there yet, is what I'm trying to say. D'Erlon's corps then launched a massive attack against Wellington's left centre, which is to say to the left of La Haye Saint. And this is like 2 divisions. It's a lot of troops. But Wellington at Waterloo has 2 British heavy cavalry brigades. So he has only, I think once he had 1 heavy cavalry brigade in the peninsula. But he has 2 here. He has the Household Brigade, which is the Blues and Royals, and the Life Guards, which are the guys you can see to this day in Whitehall in London. And I think they were joined by the 1st Royal Dragoons, I think, who were a heavy dragoon unit. The British Household Cavalry did not wear their cuirasses in battle at this stage. They didn't, but they were still big guys on big horses with big swords. And Wellington also had, famously, the Union Brigade, which was made up of 1 Scottish, the Scots Greys, 1 Irish, the Enniskillen Dragoons, and 1 English heavy dragoon regiments. And again, these are big guys on big horses with big straight swords. And so Wellington has 2 brigades of these guys. And
they would come. Sorry.
No, what were you going to say?
I was just saying these were commanded by Lord Edward of Somerset and Sir William Ponsonby. Yeah.
Yes, indeed they were. Anyway, Uxbridge's cavalry commander unleashes these guys against D'Erlon's advancing corps, and basically they wreck it. The French don't have time to get into square, and some of them panic. These big guys on big thundering horses with their big straight swords are quite scary. I don't know what Novitrix's saying. They don't achieve much. Yes, they do. They destroy 2 French divisions pretty well. They basically destroyed D'Erlon's attack. They kill and wound a lot of Frenchmen. They capture some. But as so often with British cavalry, they're great at doing charges. They really are. But they tend to then get out of control. And instead of rallying and going back to their position, having achieved a wonderful victory, they go on and they try and attack the French artillery battery. And they do indeed get to it, and they do saber quite a few French gunners, but they can be replaced. And that enables the French to counterattack them with their cavalry. And by this time, the British horses are blown, and so they lose a lot of men. And by the time they get back to the British lines, the Union Brigade and the Household Brigade, and particularly the Union Brigade, which went further, have lost. The Union Brigade was probably half its strength when it got back to the British lines, and the Household Brigade was probably about a third down. So, this was, as I say, successful cavalry charge, but as so often, And Wellington was very critical of his cavalry because he said they got this habit of galloping at everything and then galloping back again as quickly as they gallop forward. And there is, to be true, some truth in it. There were good British cavalry commanders, but they were few and far between. And there were good British cavalry regiments, but again, they were pretty few and far between. And in particular, British cavalry was not anywhere near as good as the French at attacking in brigade-sized formations, or let alone division-sized formations. They just weren't very good at that at this stage. Black Pigeon Pilled says, did Wellington really describe his men as the scum of the earth? Yes, he did. But he added, but it is wonderful, the fine fellows that we have made them. Wellington said, they're all the scum of the earth, enlisted for drink, but it is wonderful, the fine fellows we have made them. And people never quote the second part of that quote. And he also said in Waterloo, famously, to a lady he was talking to, because Wellington was a bit of a ladies' man, he was asked by this woman, will you beat Napoleon? And Wellington was in this Brussels park, and he was looking at a British redcoat who was strolling around looking at the statues. And he pointed to him and he said, it all depends on that article. If I have enough of it, I'm sure of it.
Sir Walter Scott, of course, the famous Scottish writer and poet and everything, he actually did, I think he did like some interviews to describe like the following, the scenes from the charge and everything, and he put together a piece, and it was mainly from the his information on Sir John Ely, who were joined in with the charge. He said Sir John Ely, who led the charge of the heavy brigade, was at one time surrounded by several of the Hussars, but being a tall and uncommonly powerful man, completely mastered of his sword and horse, he cut his way out, leaving several of his assailants on the ground, marked with wounds, indicating the unusual strength of the arm which inflicted them. Indeed, had not the ghastly evidence remained on the field, many of the blows dealt upon this occasion would have seemed borrowed from the annals of knight errantry. So, Sir Walter Scott, I think he actually toured the battlefield quite a year after.
Quite a few people did. The illustration up at the moment is Sergeant Hewitt of the Scots Greys, who are the only regular Scottish cavalry regiment, capturing a French eagle at Waterloo. And for that feat, he was commissioned, made an officer. And his son was also an officer in the Scots Greys as well. And if you go to Edinburgh Castle today, just below it is a pub named after Sergeant Hewitt. That I don't know if they've changed the pub sign, but he used to have a painting of Hewitt capturing the eagle. But Hewitt, he cut down quite a few Frenchmen to capture this French eagle, obviously, because the French didn't want to give it up. And his account is quite bloodthirsty. And he talks about one guy who he cut down through the head into his teeth. So, yeah, indeed. But yeah, so Hewitt's a big British hero of the Battle of Waterloo, and I don't know if you still can, but you used to be able to see the eagle that he captured in the National Army Museum in Chelsea. I don't know if it's still there.
I believe it is.
So yeah, that's part of the Scots Greys charge. Here we have Wellington rallying some of his troops in square. And on the left of the picture, you can see a couple of guys from the Royal Horse Artillery who wore these tarleton-style helmets. And the Royal Horse Artillery were different from the Royal Field Artillery in that all the gunners were mounted so they could move much more quickly, keep up with the cavalry and this sort of stuff. let me see, what's our next illustration? This is part of the Household Brigade charging. This is the Blues and Royals. And this is a bit later in the battle, and they're counter-attacking the French cuirassiers. Someone is saying it's the wrong eagle. That one was stolen and destroyed. I didn't know that, but it is entirely possible. Anything from Mitch or Jack or AI?
Well, I'll just mention why Napoleon committed D'Erloncourt to the centre, which was what led to this chain of events that we've just discussed. So there's a couple reasons for it. One is that Napoleon, that is, didn't quite recognise how strong Picton's centre was. Picton, who I can't believe none of us have mentioned, turned up to the battlefield without his uniform. So he was commanding this position in the centre, and Napoleon decided to commit D'Erloncourt because he couldn't see much of Picton's forces, most of whom were behind Mont Saint-Jean, and so hidden from view. And then there's also the fact that in general, during this time, the general strategy for winning a battle often relied on holding what they called the central position. And there's a few important reasons why an army might want to hold that position. One is that it allows you to then defeat your enemy in detail. You can, if you hold the central ground and split their force in two, decide to focus on one part of their army and defeat it, and then turn around and focus and defeat the other. The original plan with D'Erloncourt was to kind of go up Picton's force in the center, break through, and then flank left. Of course, it didn't work, as we mentioned, with Uxbridge ordering the cavalry charge against them and then retreating, and then, as I'm sure we'll get to, the French cavalry counterattacks.
Yes, indeed.
So Picton pulled a Julian the Apostate move, with what you're telling me.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes, and
of.
actually, it's a good comparison because they both died. In Picton's case, it wasn't because of his lack of uniform, but yes.
His top hat that he was wearing is you used to be able to see that in the National Army Museum, and it's still got the hole in that killed him.
I see.
He was leading his men forward. Picton, by the way, was a brilliant, hard-swearing but brilliant Welsh general who recently lefties have been disliking a lot because he served in Jamaica or whatever it might have been. But he was one of Wellington's more reliable generals. Wasn't somebody who Wellington would usually give an independent command to, but he was very trustworthy in terms of doing what he was told to do, and a very brave man. But then there's a statue to him in Brecon, quite close to where the South Wales Borderers Museum is, that I have been to. So anyway, following this defeat of D'Erlon's attack, which was quite a big deal, because if you think about it, there's two divisions tied up flying around Hougoumont. There's another two divisions that have been, if not entirely destroyed, pretty well dispersed by the attack of the British heavy cavalry. And so what Napoleon doesn't, he's lost the use of four divisions at this stage. And it is about this stage that people start noticing there might be some Prussians some way off, and Napoleon has to keep some forces to deal with those guys. Meanwhile, Wellington is like shuffling his troops around. He was a very hands-on commander. He didn't trust other people, and I can understand why, because when he was first in the peninsula particularly, he had some very incompetent officers. So he was very hands-on, and he was shuffling troops around. Troops were sometimes withdrawing, sometimes lying down. And from the French lines, as Jack just mentioned, you couldn't always see what was going on in the British position very clearly. But Marshal Ney seems to have got the idea that the Brits were falling back and decides he's going to launch a cavalry attack to take advantage of this.
This doesn't sound good.
No, it's seriously not a good idea.
And it's worth noting, this is one of the moments in the battle when Napoleon leaves the field because of his cancer.
Yeah.
Well,
he's
whatever illness. Yeah, people, as I say, I've heard people say he had piles. I've heard all sorts of things, but he did relinquish command for a while.
Yeah, he went to one of the farmhouses and sort of like came back and was like, "Nay, what have you done?" And it was in the film. It was like he's just like ranting, raving, saying, "Nay, why do you attack without infantry support? Why are they forming squares? What have you done?"
However, of course, it's worth pointing out that Napoleon was not always entirely truthful in his subsequent writings, particularly if he could blame something that went wrong on somebody else. And Ney, by the time Napoleon was writing about this, Ney was a dead man.
Although it seems highly likely, just because it's such an amateur mistake to send such a large cavalry attack unsupported against a position that you can't even see.
Well, although to be fair, when Napoleon returns, he actually reinforces Ney's cavalry attacks a bit.
Yes, although it's committed by that point.
Yeah, I mean, he either wins with it or he doesn't. But yeah, Build, it's Ney who kind of takes command when Napoleon absence.
Ney is the most senior marshal there still left, and so he takes command. And his actual attack is supported by Kellerman.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to like the thing about Ney's attack is never spiked for cannons, so that's one thing that I don't know if Napoleon harangued him over it, but I know that's one thing historians just look at and go, why didn't Ney spike for cannons at the very least? Because the artillery crews had to hide in the squares, and had he spiked for guns, it would have given Napoleon a much better advantage.
Except for Mercer's troop, Mitch. Mercer's troop didn't, because the square behind them was a Dutch Nassau square, and Mercer thought if they saw his men running to take cover, and Mercer was a Royal Horse Artillery dude, he thought if the Dutch Belgians in the square of very young, inexperienced soldiers saw his gunners running to take cover in their square, they'd probably run as well. So he chose to stick with his guns and just fire canister at the French as they came up. And they fired it quickly enough that the French weren't able to get to them.
I've got a quote here from a Captain Rees Howe Grono from the Foot Guards, who was able to actually, this is from the British perspective of the first French cavalry attack, and he put it together quite well. So this is on Ney's attack, the infamous attack here. He says, around 4 p.m, the enemy artillery in front of us ceased firing, and all of a sudden we saw a large mass of cavalry advance. Not a man present who survived could have forgotten in afterlife the awful grandeur of that charge. You discovered at a distance what appeared to begin overwhelming, long-moving line, which, ever advancing, glittered like a stormy wave of the sea when it catches the sunlight. On they came until they got near enough, whilst the very earth seemed to vibrate beneath the thundering tramp of the mounted host. One might suppose that nothing could have resisted the shock of this terrible moving mass. They were the famous Hussars, almost all old soldiers who had distinguished themselves on most of the battlefields of Europe. In an almost incredibly short period, they were within 20 yards of us, shouting "Vive Empereur!" The word of command. The word of command, prepared to receive cavalry, had been given. Every man in front ranks knelt, and a wall bristling with steel, held together by steady hands, presented itself to the infuriated Hussars. So that's also when they go into squares. He didn't mention the squares bit, but what he's saying is that's when they went into squares. There you go. And I will say, I went to a reenactment of an English Civil War where there was a brief period where I could stand next to it was 20 men on horseback doing a charge, demonstrating a charge. And I can tell you, even with 20 men, the earth, there was that vibration. It was like really intimidating to even see at like a sort of a very, very smaller scale. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It would have been intimidating, and that's why you needed steady, confident troops. But if you had steady, confident troops, as I was saying earlier, it's almost impossible for cavalry to break a steady, disciplined infantry.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because I mean, they're one thing you find in some sort of like, I've got a quote. There's like a bit here from Wellington at Waterloo by Weller. For example, he likes to talk about, I've got my notes here, the psychological effect of using mass cavalry in that way as a way to sort of like basically like scare the to disrupt artillery and to square the infantry away from squares. But as you said, because these are experienced, that they weren't going to break, they weren't going to break rank in squares.
And sorry, guys.
Oh,
I'm still here. Have we lost anyone? I don't think we have.
I think we're still all here.
Yeah, sorry, my computer is playing silly buggers at the moment. I beg your pardon, guys. I suspect it's because I'm trying to run all these slides.
Maybe.
I can't think of another. It doesn't normally do this. So anyway, let me get to where we got to.
Also, apparently, one artillery officer disobeyed Wellington's order to seek shelter in
Mercer.
square.
I was just talking about Mercer.
Yeah.
The reason he disobeyed him is because he was worried that the young Dutch Nassau troops behind him would run if they saw his gunners running. So he thought, bugger it, we'll stand to our guns. And as I said, you could fire canister from cannon, and that turned it into a giant shotgun. And if you fired it quickly enough, you could mow down the French cavalry in front of you. And of course, the other thing that happened is, as the French cavalry flowed past these squares, the British cavalry counterattacked them. And that's what's happening with the illustration on the screen at the moment. And that is the Blues and Royals countercharging some of the French cuirassiers.
Yeah.
Here we have some British infantry advancing. In the uniform they would have worn at Waterloo. Sorry, guys, carry on.
I've also got a quote here from Mercer, and he says, Captain Mercer says, "I thus allowed them to advance unmolested until they heard, till the head of the column might have been about 50 or 60 yards from us, and then gave the word fire. The effect was terrible. Nearly the whole leading rank," so this is referring to the French, "fell at once, and the round shot penetrating the column carried confusion throughout its extent, and the discharge of every gun was followed by a fall of men and horses like that of grass before a mower's scythe."
Indeed, that sounds like using canister on people. This is also another illustration of a Highland Square at Waterloo, and it's a quite famous painting. And you can see the cuirassiers advancing. I think they're probably moving too quickly in the painting, to be honest, because, as I said, you couldn't actually make a horse charge into an unbroken wall of bayonets. And the guys should be in 4 ranks, and the latter 2 ranks are firing at the same time. They're still firing platoon volleys. So, and of course, the French are going to get, if they're going in between infantry squares, they're going to be fired from all directions, fired at from all directions.
In the Waterloo film, I don't know if this is like, if they deliberately recreated it, or if that's how the horses behaved, but when they got to the squares, the horses just sort of they were running, they were sort of mounted, charging around the squares, like doing circular motions around the squares. And I'm assuming that's probably how it went down as well on the battlefield. There were just circular motions around the squares while the infantry were sort of returning fire.
Yeah. They wouldn't have charged
and then
directly
the
at
British
squares.
cavalry are counter-attacking them as well. And again, this is what we've got in this illustration, which is the life guards. As I said, the British household cavalry didn't wear their cuirasses in action. They left them at home. And in this illustration, the life guards are attacking the French cuirassiers. And there's also a guy from the rifle brigade in this picture. So presumably it's somewhere not too far from La Haye Sainte. And these French cavalry attacks, they got bigger as more and more troops were thrown into them. And as I was saying to Jack earlier, and I think he agreed with me, when Napoleon comes back, although he is not best pleased with what Ney is doing, he has little choice but to try and reinforce it.
Yep. There's not much you can do at that point, but try and push through.
And unfortunately for the French, of course, it doesn't go anywhere. None of the British infantry squares are broken. Some of the Allied troops do bugger off. Some of the Allied cavalry bugger off. The Cumberland Hussars in particular go all the way to Brussels, telling everyone that they're a unit from Hanover. And they ride all the way to Brussels, telling everyone who they meet that Wellington's been defeated and the British army is all dead. So there we go.
Well, that should have been punished.
Well, they were a volunteer unit, so probably not much happened to them, to be honest. They did lose a couple of guys at Waterloo, but they ran away pretty early.
Well, wouldn't you get court-martialed for just doing stuff like that? You just just running all the way.
Yeah, because that sounds like. I mean, they should. I mean, not. Call me old-fashioned here, Iron Duke, but I think that should be like a sort of a hanging offence.
Listen, I'm for sure. I mean, it's desertion in the face of the enemy, but yeah, for sure. Here we have another British infantry square facing the French cavalry attacks. Not only the cuirassiers, but also the French Guard cavalry got involved. Also, at least one, I think it was actually two of their light cavalry brigades got involved. So there were thousands of French cavalry doing these attacks. Certainly more than the British had ever seen when fighting in Spain and Portugal. And also in Spain and Portugal, the cuirassiers didn't really fight there, certainly not very much. And most of the cavalry the Brits had faced in Spain and Portugal in the peninsula had been dragoons and chasseurs and occasional lancers of one sort or another. Not the Polish and Dutch lancers, but the French line lancer guys. But they hadn't faced this many heavy cavalry in the peninsula. But fortunately, they were well trained enough that none of the British squares broke.
Just a more point, I don't think were the Polish even still a thing in Napoleon's army by the time of Waterloo? Because
you're right, Mitch. They were called the Polish Lancers, just like the others were called the Dutch Lancers. But by this stage, most of them were actually probably French, to be honest. Yeah,
because you had Poniatowski, who died at Leipzig, and it's with stuff like, and especially from Leipzig after the failed invasion of Russia and Battle of Leipzig. I'm pretty sure, and also with stuff that happened to Haiti. I'm pretty sure that most of the Polish who served under Napoleon by this time would be dead, or they've just gone back home.
Yeah, the units kept their names, Mitch, but they weren't really the nationality anymore.
It's likely there were a fair few, just on the basis that they didn't have somewhere to go back to, because of course after the failure
of the disaster of 1812,
yes, exactly. Poland was once again partitioned, or the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, should we say, was once again partitioned. And obviously the whole reason that the Poles are on Napoleon's side was because he came in and gave them that land that they had previously lost to Austria, Russia, and Prussia, and that had all been undone again.
Yeah, the Congress of Vienna would sort of, the final partition, the final sort of like partition until the end of the First World War.
Yeah, well, the Congress of Vienna, which was going on at this time, it started in 1814, and of course it went on through Waterloo and would conclude in 1815. And of course, as we all know, spoiler alert, the French lose Waterloo, and so they're unable to reverse any of these changes.
Oh no, Jack! I was getting invested in the story. You've ruined it for me now.
Valero 393 says, "Is this the Juneteenth stream?" No, this is the 18th of June stream about the Battle of Waterloo, my friend. The illustration on the screen at the moment are British Hussars, light cavalry attacking some French infantry. It's probably worth mentioning. Napoleonic cavalry, broadly speaking, was two types. It was heavy cavalry and light cavalry. Heavy cavalry was dragoons, cuirassiers, carbineers in the French case, that sort of thing. Light cavalry was hussars, light dragoons, or in the French case, chasseurs. And lancers were kind of like medium light cavalry. The British didn't have lancers at this stage. We only brought them in 1816. But we did have hussars and light dragoons, and these are British hussars, who are light cavalry. Light cavalry was supposed to be better at scouting and reconnaissance and skirmishing, whereas heavy cavalry were meant to break enemy forces, although both types could do each other's job to some degree.
So during the second French infantry attack on the squares, after Ney sort of like balls up, Uxbridge tried to lead Dutch carbineers under Major General Tripp to renew attack, but members of the British cavalry, they claimed that the Dutch carbineers refused. However, but the thing there is, then later on, like much later on, like years later, Dutch and Belgium sources, like historians and stuff, say, "Oh, that's not true. There's no evidence to support that." But and Wellington never really got involved with that. There was like one letter where he just said, "Oh, General Tripp conducted himself with much to my satisfaction." So he didn't actually get drawn into that sort of like debate. But either way,
Wellington didn't always give as much praise as he should have done to his troops. He even said that himself. But he also equally was he very seldom attacked units in action. In his dispatches, that was not his style. He used to get enraged when people did stuff when they weren't in action that was like looting and what have you, particularly because that would turn the local people against you. But he was not somebody who would pick out, because a unit didn't perform very well on one occasion. It wasn't really Wellington's style to pick that out. The current illustration, by the way, is a Royal Field Artillery 9-pounder, probably. Yeah, definitely a 9-pounder, which is the biggest gun the British really used at Waterloo. And this is the foot artillery, where the guns were obviously pulled by horses, but the men used to march rather than be mounted. What else have we got here? This is a counterattack. Colborne, I believe. Carry on, Mitch.
I was just going to say, that illustration you showed just before about the artillery, that's from a guy called Ben Puck, who's got an article. He's very good at drawing illustrations of the Napoleonic Wars, and I put his put his Instagram handle in the chat. I don't know why it's not showing up, but B Puck POOK Art on Instagram. If anyone's looking for good Napoleonic War illustrations.
Cool. Darren Buckley says, "Who were the Grenadiers then?" Well, the
Heavy infantry.
every infantry battalion had a grenadier company, and they were usually the tallest, biggest guys in the regiment, and they often led attacks and things like that. But by the time of Waterloo, grenades themselves weren't really used. Grenades had been an 18th century thing, basically. They were occasionally used in the Napoleonic Wars, but not very commonly. And grenadiers certainly didn't normally carry them. They would just be basically the biggest guys, and they would use them for assaults and this kind of stuff. This is Colborne's Light Infantry Regiment, by the way, advancing to attack the French. I will also put
Is that Picton on the ground there?
No, I don't think so. Oh, I suppose it could be, actually.
Because I'm looking at the top.
Yeah,
top
it could be. Yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, maybe it's meant to be. Maybe it is. It could be meant to be. So anyway, after the French cavalry attacks, by this time the Prussians are coming more into action. They still haven't got anything like the whole of their army there, but they're pulling off more of the French troops. Like Napoleon has to use his young guard to hold a village that the Prussians are coming into.
Yeah, Bülow, who was one of the Prussian commanders, his 4th Corps arrived on the field, and so Napoleon had to divert his 6th Corps all the way across the battlefield to deal with it under the command of Lobau.
And of course, it's worth mentioning that had Grouchy been doing what Napoleon wanted him to do, this wouldn't have been able to happen. Grouchy
follow the sounds of the cannon.
Yeah, I mean, Grouchy he could hear the Battle of Waterloo going on, he could hear the guns, but instead of marching to the guns, which is normally the best thing for a soldier to do, he didn't. He continued his rather leisurely pursuit of the Prussians, and he did actually end up fighting some of them, but not most of them.
Did he ever explain? Was there ever an explanation after the battle why he didn't think, oh shit, the battle's going on, well I better march to the sound of the battle?
I don't think he ever gave a satisfactory explanation. No, I don't know if Jack knows more about that than I do. He may do.
There's no kind of public explanation from his specific account that we're aware of. Most people have speculated reasons. So one of them is that, he heard the battle over there, but his orders were to pursue the Prussians, and so he wanted to keep doing that, obviously with no idea where they were. But very much he's treated as the scapegoat for Waterloo from the French perspective.
So I don't think that. Sorry, mate. I don't think that is supposed to be Picton, and the reason I don't is this is actually much later in the battle. These guys are advancing to attack the French Guard.
I mean, it could be whoever illustrated this maybe mixed up.
Entirely possible. Entirely.
It could. Was there anyone else on the battlefield with a top hat?
No idea, but quite likely.
Anyone else pull a Julian the Apostate move?
Well, don't forget, a lot of the British officers had come directly from the Duchess of Richmond's ball and were still in kind of mess dress rather than in their field uniforms.
Oh, so it could have just been a random officer.
Yeah, quite a lot of British officers came from the Duchess of Richmond's ball and didn't have time to change into their field uniforms. And at a ball, you would wear kind of what the equivalent in those days of mess dress, which is not what you would wear if you were actually fighting. So some of them had dainty little shoes on instead of decent boots and all that sort of thing.
So, I mean, Darren Buckley before you could say also pulling Alexander the Great move, Gaugamela again, not wearing the appropriate attire. But yeah,
Yeah, it has been. It has been known that troops don't always do that sort of thing. So anyway, with the Prussians becoming more of a threat, and Napoleon running out of infantry and his cavalry being largely a spent force now, he doesn't really have a lot of option but to try and pierce Wellington's position, which he has not done at all so far, with his Imperial Guard. And so he launches the famous Imperial Guard attack on the British position. And it's worth pointing out this wasn't just the Imperial Guard. There were a lot of French line infantry following on behind in the hope of reinforcing their victory.
Yeah, and one of the things that's worth noting is that it was specifically the middle guard section of the Imperial Guard. So the Imperial Guard was made up of three of
Yes.
the infantry. It was made up of three sections: the Young Guard, Middle Guard, and Old Guard. And there was a seniority to them, and this was the Middle Guard.
And it was also they were also divided into grenadiers and chasseurs, I believe, as well.
Yes, and of course there was the Imperial Guard cavalry and everything. So
yeah, and some of the
almost
Imperial
a mini
Guard
army.
some of the Imperial Guard cavalry had already taken part in these big cavalry assaults that Ney started. And Ney had, I think, 3 horses shot under him during the charges. I think it was 3. It might have been 4.
At this point of the attack of the Imperial Guard, by this point the French should have already captured La Haye-Sainte.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for reminding me, AI. Part of the reason for this was the fact that the King's German Legion light companies were holding the place. Now, they had an ammunition wagon of their own, but a French howitzer shell hit it and blew it up. And as a result, it was very difficult to get them ammunition because they didn't use Brown Bess musket balls. And Brown Bess musket balls wouldn't fit into their Baker rifles. And it was mainly because the King's German Legion light companies ran out of ammunition that the French were able to successfully storm La Haye. If they hadn't have run out of ammunition, it's quite likely the French would never have captured the place. But as it was, the King's German Legion guys held the place with the bayonet for a while. But you're not going to win against guys with firearms when all you've got is a bayonet, even in those days.
There's Novatrix in the chat has asked what percentage of the French forces did he command. I'm assuming he means Grouchy.
Yeah, I think it was 30,000 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, 1/3.
It was between 30,000 and 40,000. So that was a couple of corps. I know that he had Van Damme and Gerard. And the reason I know that is because I'm shocked that Napoleon sent Van Damme off in this action, because he usually had him leading the vanguard. And he would have been particularly useful in the Battle of Waterloo, I think. He played a very key role.
Maybe he thought he would hurry Grouchy in his pursuit.
Maybe. So it was, about a third of the entire French force, so quite a sizable amount.
And as I said, Grouchy did end up fighting some Prussians, but not all that many of them, and not enough to keep some of them away from Waterloo.
Yeah. I think it's worth highlighting. I think we did mention it earlier. Grouchy was quite inexperienced. He was a reserve cavalry commander rather than a corps commander, really.
Yeah, was it Gerard who said follow the end of the guns, and Grouchy, for what reason I don't fully understand, he just vetoed the idea, going, "Well,
he just said, I'm going to follow the letter of my orders," which is always the easy thing for an untalented soldier to do. Because if you follow the letter of the orders, you're probably not going to get into trouble,
Gerard and Van Damme underneath Grouchy being much, much, much more experienced commanders.
Yeah, he would have, he would have done much better by Napoleon and the French if he'd have marched towards Waterloo, for sure. I don't think he would have changed the way the battle went, but he might have stopped the French from completely dissolving as they did.
Yeah, I mean, Grouchy's actions are very similar to what we said earlier about Bernadotte at Jena Auerstadt. It was the same thing. Bernadotte's refusal to go and support Third Corps under Davout. Luckily for Napoleon, in Jena Auerstadt, Third Corps managed to single-handedly win, whereas it wasn't the case at Waterloo.
So yeah. Anyway, this illustration is Colborne's 52nd Light Infantry, who were an extremely good British regiment. And the light infantry, as I explained earlier, they were trained that all of their companies were able to skirmish and what have you, but they could equally well fight in line. And Colborne's 52nd, along with the British Foot Guards, defeated the Imperial Guard attack. And famously, the French started to retreat, and the cry went up in the French army, "La Garde recule," which is, the guards retreating, which they didn't normally do. The French Imperial Guard were nicknamed the Immortals, but it was partly because Napoleon didn't use them very much, so they didn't get killed as much as the other guys. So there was a bit of dry humor in that French nickname for the Imperial Guard, but it was a fact they were very seldom repulsed.
Yes, and we shouldn't downplay how capable the men of the Imperial Guard were. Obviously, it required a lot to get into soldiers. That. Yeah, it required a lot to even get there in the first place. And when they were used, they were very capable. They were used a lot in 1814. We mentioned earlier about how risk-averse Napoleon was in Borodino, and how he wasn't so risk-averse when it came to the Six-Day Campaign in 1814. And part of that was his heavy use of the Imperial Guard.
But at Waterloo, the Guard march up, and again, there's the same problem that the French have all day. They don't totally know the position in Wellington's position because they can't see it very well, because it's uphill and also largely on a reverse slope. And so the Guard march up and find themselves walking into just a wall of fire, not just in front of them, but on both flanks. And that's why they retreat when the British put in a bayonet charge.
I've got a pretty good little segment, like a quote here, but also a segment here, which about when the Guard wavered. And this is from Dehaan, who was a Captain Dehaan of... it was 19th Militia, Dutch. And he says, as the Guard wavered, Chase galloped among the men and found Captain Dehaan and a few soldiers from 19th Militia, whom he ordered into a flank attack. According to Chase, Dehaan jumped over the hedge, reformed the line of about 50 men, and the murderous fire he inflicted caused death and confusion among the enemy lines. He took advantage of their confusion and advanced with bayonet against them. I had the unspeakable joy of witnessing 300 Hussars run away from 50 Dutchmen armed with bayonets. So yeah, there you go. That happened as well among that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly possible. I should probably just show this last of my maps. Where are we? And that one. This is the map which shows the French Imperial Guard attack and what have you. So later stages of the Battle of Waterloo. By this stage, it's kind of late afternoon, and with all the powder smoke, don't forget gunpowder gives you great big thick grey-white clouds of smoke all over the place, particularly when you've just fired, if there's no wind. And so it was getting pretty dark by this stage, not only because it was getting late in the day, but also, although it was June, but also because of the thick clouds of smoke, black powder smoke. So yes, and following the repulse of the Guard, the French army turns out to be quite brittle because with the repulse of the Guard and people shouting about the Guard retreating, the French army starts to break. Large portions of it, not all of it. There are French units which carry on fighting, but quite a lot of it does break. And the illustration on here at the moment is Wellington ordering his whole line to advance, which he did towards the end of the battle. And the soldiers you can see in the right foreground are grenadiers of the British Guards. Now, that's why they've got bearskins on in this picture, because the grenadiers did wear bearskins in the Guards. But as a result of as a result of the victory over the Guards, that the British Guards today all wear bearskins. That was something the Prince Regent granted them after the battle. So this is the whole line of Wellington's line advancing. Far from Wellington being almost beaten, his line is able to advance. This picture is also quite interesting, and it's a British officer capturing Cambron, the French Imperial Guard officer.
I've got a quote here from Marshal Ney during this sort of French disintegration of the army, and he says, Marshal Ney says, "There remain to us still 4 squares of the old guard to protect the retreat. These brave grenadiers, the choice of the army, forced successfully to retire, yielded ground foot by foot till overwhelmed by numbers. They were almost entirely annihilated. From that moment, the retrograde movement was declared, and the army formed nothing but a confused mass. There was not, however, a total rout, nor a cry of sauve Cupid.
Every man for himself, yes.
Yeah, as has been basically what he says is wrongfully stated in bulletins later on.
Yeah, there's also the legend that it might have even been Cambron actually, but one of the Imperial Guard commanders, when called upon to surrender, said, "The Guard dies, it doesn't surrender." Apparently that's bullshit. And also someone else is supposed to have said "merde," which is obviously French for shit. And I think it was Cambron said that any officer that had said that at the time wouldn't have survived because they were totally surrounded by British troops at this stage. So,
yeah,
so he always denied it. He said, "No, never said that."
It was Lord Hill who was the one that basically approached the remnants of the Guards, and I think Lord Hill, he spoke out in French, basically saying, "Come to surrender," basically.
Yes.
The jig's up, surrender.
Indeed. This is a picture of another British infantry regiment capturing some French Guard artillery.
Yeah.
And is the last one that I have for today. But I thought it was worth showing a few of these things. In the at the end of the Battle of Waterloo, the British Army was advancing and capturing Frenchmen and their guns. So I guess what I would really like people to take away from this is that, all right, Napoleon was by no means at his best. I mean, you don't absent yourself from the battle in the middle of the battle. But on the other hand, he didn't really come that close to breaking Wellington's position. Now, Wellington said it was a damn close run thing and all that sort of thing. And of course, you don't run down your enemy because if you're not fighting a good enemy, you're not very good yourself, are you? But also, it was the French artillery which caused huge British losses that day. The cavalry caused relatively few losses. In fact, the British infantry squares were quite relieved when the French cavalry came back, because that meant the French gunners couldn't target them so much. And it was the French artillery which was the big thing that was killing lots and lots of blokes during the day.
In all fairness to Ney, when you had the second French infantry attack, that was when Ney was quite close to breaking the British centre.
I don't think he was. Not close.
I don't know. I think they were close. I think
Wellington was always able to bring further reserves to where they were needed. I mean, part of the reason he liked the position that he chose was there was a road behind it, which meant he could move his troops quite quickly. But considering how poor Wellington's army was, or some of it, I should say, considering what poor qualities a lot of his army was, I don't think the French came that close to breaking him. I really don't.
Well, I think the trouble was that the infantry was sent up too late because Napoleon, he left the battlefield, came back, saw what happened, and if he was present, maybe that would have been different. But also, the other big thing is why they didn't spike the British guns when they had the chance, as you mentioned earlier.
I don't think that would have broken the infantry squares, even if they'd done that. But yeah, it certainly would have made their life a little bit easier, for sure.
I think it would have probably done a bit more because the guns were able then to certify canister, and that was what kept the infantry.
I mean, they should have spiked the guns. You're quite right, but I mean, you could say the same thing about the British Union Brigade when they got to the main French battery. They didn't spike the guns either. And incidentally, for anyone who doesn't know, spiking the guns is putting something a bit like a nail into the touch hole on the top of the cannon and hammering it home. And until you get a special tool, that makes that gun useless. You can't fire it again.
Mm-hmm.
But by the way, I just mentioned, guys, that on occasions we had 120 viewers at points to this evening.
Oh, cool.
Popular stream.
Pretty good guy. Jack, any final thoughts on this? I mean, I suppose we should just say, look, Napoleon retreated, tried to reorganize his army, but basically wasn't able to. There was some fighting later on after Waterloo, but not on a huge scale. And eventually, Napoleon was forced to surrender to HMS.
It was the Bellerophon.
The Billy Ruffian, as the sailors used to call her, HMS Bellerophon. And there's a guy in the Discord whose ancestor used to be the captain of HMS Bellerophon.
It was also, a lot of people don't know, present at the Battle of the Nile.
Yes, it was. Famous. Bellerophon in its day was a famous Royal Navy line of battleship. She was a second-rate 74,
Yes.
but a very good ship. but yeah, so Napoleon surrendered to the Brits, and I think the reason he surrendered to the Brits was, had he surrendered to the Prussians or the Russians or even the Austrians, it's quite liable he would have been executed. The Brits didn't execute him, but sent him to St. Helena, which is quite a pleasant subtropical island in the Atlantic, but a long way from anywhere. He wasn't getting away from there, and also there was a British governor and a garrison, so he certainly wasn't getting away from St. Helena. But again, he was given quite a nice large farmhouse to live in. He had the run of the island, he had horses, he had a small court there of officials and what have you, and officers. Wrote his memoirs. Again, considering the hundreds of thousands of guys he got killed, directly and indirectly, I think he did quite well. But I think if the Prussians had got hold of him, they would have almost certainly executed him.
Yeah, because one thing to note, that I think I St. Helena, there's actually like a tortoise there who was alive with Napoleon.
That's possible. Yeah, those big tortoises can live 150 years for sure.
Yeah, and I remember because there's a famous quote from when the Imperial Guard is being surrounded and invited to surrender, and the reporter said, "Le garde meurt ne s'allonge pas," which means the guard dies, he does not surrender. and that's of course when they all get killed. And then after the battle, Wellington and Blucher meet, but the funny thing was neither of them could speak each other's languages, so they had to speak in French.
And do a handshake, yes, indeed.
Yeah, and the conversation goes something like 20 years it took, and they said like, oh well, we Prussians drew first blood, but you British had, you had a bloody business, like you cut the throat, because a lot of German idioms work weirdly, and it goes, oh, you've made history for your England today. So that's kind of
also it's worth pointing out that what the Prussians did do was, because their troops were relatively fresh, they were able to pursue the French relentlessly and stop them rallying and making a stand anyway. If the Russians hadn't have been there, the British army would have been too exhausted and had too many casualties to do that, for sure.
And it's worth noting that the entire Battle of Waterloo was conditioned by the fact that the Prussians were present on both sides. Of course, Wellington's strategy relied a lot on the capacity for reinforcements, and Napoleon's, of course, was fighting against the clock, which explains some of his more aggressive tactics.
Listen, I mean, you've got to say that even had Napoleon's strategy worked, and if he'd have beaten the Prussians more thoroughly at Ligny, and they had then retreated back towards Prussia, i.e. away from Wellington, and had Napoleon then somehow managed to beat Wellington thoroughly, he was very, very unlikely to survive, because there were massive Russian and Prussian and Austrian armies coming up. There would have been Portuguese and Spanish forces. There would have been a lot more Prussians. There would have been more Brits, as they came back from America. Napoleon's strategy in the 100 Days was always a long shot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the belief that he couldn't have possibly won that campaign.
Yeah,
I think the numbers against him
it would have been remarkable. He would have had to have won a much more serious victory at Ligny and made the Prussians retreat towards Prussia. And then he would have absolutely had to have destroyed Wellington's army as well. And again, that wouldn't have been that easy for him to do.
And then he would have had to go on and defeat the Russians and the Austrians and the Spanish.
Yeah. Who are just going to chuck in more and more troops, as they did in 1814.
From multiple directions, yeah.
So guys, Waterloo's over, but we've forgotten one important person who's yet to be accounted for. And this is called General Grouchy, who about an hour and a half after effectively the end of the battle, if you will, is still following his orders of pursuing the Prussians. And he defeated General Thielmann at was it Waverley? And then said to Wavre, sorry. Here you go, Wavre, and then withdrew shortly after. And of course,
that was the bit of fighting that Grouchy did that we've talked about a couple of times during the stream.
Yeah, a couple of times, and that was the sort of final bit. Though I actually have got this is from Major W.E. Fry, who account, I believe, made its way into, I think, several of the British newspapers at the time. Now, this is on the 22nd of June, so this is a few days after. And he says that this morning I went to visit the field of battle, which is a little beyond the village of Waterloo, on the plateau of Mont Saint-Jean. But on the arrival there, the sight was too horrible to behold. I felt sick in the stomach and was obliged to return. The multitude of carcasses, the heaps of wounded men, and the mangled limbs, unable to move, and perishing from not having their wounds dressed, or from hunger, as the Allies were, of course, obliged to take their surgeons and wagons with them, formed a spectacle I shall never forget. The wounded, both of the Allies and the French, remained in equally deplorable state.
Very true, very true. There's another thing about Waterloo. for many years afterwards, people who lost their teeth, who needed false teeth, used to get Waterloo teeth, which were teeth taken from dead soldiers at Waterloo.
Yeah, I thought one thing that's also interesting about Waterloo was and this is one thing that people are supposed to say. So the shortest soldiers on the battlefield were the Dutch, because the average Dutch height at that time was like 5'4", whereas average British height was like 5'6", and Prussians were like 5'7". Whereas now it's completely gone the other way regarding the Dutch.
Yeah, it's quite strange. The Dutch are tall guys these days, supposedly. But then heights have changed quite a lot, because a lot of it is down to the feeding you get when you're a child and what have you. So, you know. But Waterloo was quite a narrow battlefield, and so it was very bloody. You know, there were a lot of casualties.
Yeah, it's kind of like similar to Battle of Stafford Bridge, where apparently many years after the battle, like you could still notice the aftermath of a battle. I'm almost surprised if some areas of a battlefield, like literally the bones of the dead, whiten the field, like they did at Stamford Bridge, like even like 50 years after the battle. I wouldn't be surprised. I can also imagine. I wonder what I can imagine the farmers who were probably spectating the battle. I can imagine after the battle they were probably made all that wealthy, because you got to factor, you know, there'll be a lot of people who will travel to that site. Plus, also, let's say, yeah, you can imagine the farmers made a lot of money off that battlefield.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the farms, though, Mitch, was totally like blown to smithereens.
There was a hell of a lot of looting. I mean, the civilians in that area looted the dead and wounded after the battle. For sure they did. Might be worth talking briefly about casualties. Wellington lost about 3,500 killed. He lost something like 10,200 wounded. And as many as 3,000 missing, although I don't know. That's going to include quite a lot of Allied deserters, I suspect. Blucher lost somewhere up to 1,200 killed. He lost about 4,000 wounded, and he had about 1,300 or so missing. Again, that's going to include some deserters. The French lost something like 25,000 killed or wounded. And that's going to be probably 8,000 of them killed, I should say. 8, 9, something like that. And they also lost about 15,000 people who deserted after the battle. So, you know, these are guys who just said, okay, I've had enough, and they didn't go back to the French colours. And the French also lost 220 guns. And perhaps one of the most tragic things is about 7,000 horses were killed.
Yeah, I remember, like, for years after the battle, like, the French had difficulties trying to recover their horse population because of the long attrition. But also, I remember, like, the Waterloo campaign after the battle, it ended with basically the Prussians pursuing, and aside from like small skirmishes, Napoleon couldn't offer battle because he was just like, it was just a matter of many men were just deserting, because you got back to as before the battle, there were plenty of like guys like Joseph Fouché and others within the French hierarchy who knew where the wind was blowing anyway. They knew full well that Napoleon was never going to win. So as soon as Napoleon's lost the battle, they'll just make their move, and that's where really, even if like, there was no miracle that Napoleon could pull out of his arse after Waterloo. Like,
I was going to say, so there's a great quote here by
no, his army was.
Sorry, there was a great quote here by the Chief of Staff.
Carry on, Aya.
Yeah, there's a great quote by the Chief of Staff to Thielmann's Prussian Third Corps, and this was, of course, none other but the historian theorist Karl von Clausewitz, and he states this, and I think this is probably the most fairest assessment of the what had happened at Waterloo and its aftermath. And he says Bonaparte and the authors who support him have always attempted to portray the great catastrophes that befell him as the result of chance. They seek to make their readers believe that through his great wisdom and extraordinary energy, the whole project had already moved forward with the greatest confidence that complete success was about a hair's breadth away, when treachery, accident, or even fate, as they sometimes call it, ruined everything. He and his supporters do not want to admit that huge mistakes, sheer recklessness, and above all, overreaching ambition that exceeded all realistic possibilities were the true causes.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Well, guys, we've been going for 3 hours. Mitch, is there anything you'd like to shill or plug?
In terms of art, regarding Napoleonic Wars, there's Ben Puck art on, or Giuseppe Rava. They do good art. Otherwise, if you want for anyone, I mean, it's a bit redundant because I imagine everyone's watched it, but Epic History TV do damn good content on Napoleonic Wars. So
yeah, and you can also on YouTube, if you look for it, you can find the movie Waterloo, which is not a bad film actually.
Yeah, the only other thing is Bernard Cornwell's book, which I quite like reading, especially how he described Beluga. Well, that really made me laugh.
Yeah, there's many good books about Waterloo and the 100 Days. There really are. There's lots. AI, anything you would like to shill or plug, sir?
No, I mean, apart from this stream, and apart from that, your channel, my channel in this.
That's AI Shire Homelander, I believe, is your channel, AI.
Yeah, that's the name we go by today.
There'll be a link in the after the stream later. There'll be a link in a pinned comment with links to AI's channel.
I think the timeline from the stream, because one of the things you wanted to get across was that there are plenty of people, and it's usually like Reddit tier lefty historian types like to, because any attempt to take bring the British people down and British history down, they all say, oh, the Prussians won this. It was the Prussians that did the heavy lifting for this, and as we've demonstrated, I mean, they turned up towards the end of the battle. Just beyond the midway point, they turned up at the end. And the bulk of the fighting with the cavalry, with the infantry, and the Imperial Guard was done, mainly by the British. You had like the 50 Dutch militia who did like an entertaining feat where they jumped over a wall and a fence and a hedge and then charged bayoneted some French cavalry. But sure, you had like those minor interesting events, but overall, the overall picture is this was a British success. This was a British success.
Look at the casualty rates. The Brits lost a hell of a lot more troops than the Prussians did. But anyway, Jack, anything you'd like to shill or push or anything like that?
Well, I guess I'll shill the Worcester Club stuff. If people go on the Worcester Club YouTube channel, we've got a whole bunch of content on there. Iron Duke at the start of the stream mentions the Peloponnesian War series that we've been doing, and we also have I can't believe it's almost been an entire year since we did this. Time's flown, but we did a 3-part series on the geopolitics of the 19th century, which actually fits nicely with this because we start it in 1815 with the Congress of Vienna and go on to just the kind of the interwar period.
If you will, Jack, if you will DM me the link that you want to put up, I'll make sure I put it in a pinned comment under the stream.
Okay.
For the like Peloponnesian War stuff and what have you, which I can recommend to people. It's really good.
And as well as kind of stuff on my front to continue the theme that Mitch started with, shilling stuff about the Napoleonic Wars. I've got a whole bunch of books that I'd recommend, but in particular, I'd recommend David Chandler's The Campaigns of Napoleon, which I consider to be the magnum opus on.
Yeah, I've read
Napoleon
that.
Wars.
That is a good book. Yep, I agree.
Excellent book. If people want more recommendations, are always welcome to reach out. I've got a whole bunch, but if I were to recommend one, I'd recommend that one. And if there's anyone watching who isn't really that familiar with Napoleonic history and has just watched this, there's loads to get into there. It was one of the most fascinating 20-year periods of human history. Very, very dramatic. So I would recommend looking into it.
I was going to say I recommend Napoleon the Great as well by Andrew Roberts, a more recent one. It goes into it's a biography of Napoleon though, but also covers his lot of his personal life and his personal foibles, like writing bizarre revenge sex fantasies as a youth, novels as a youth.
I'd also recommend The Iron Duke, which is both a book and a TV documentary series by an extremely good British historian whose name is escaping me at the moment. Richard Holmes. Really good military biography of Wellington. All right, guys. I thank you very much to my guests, Mitch, AI, and Jack. Most welcome, most enjoyable stream. And as always, if it works, I'm going to play us out with a bit of a tune. We shall see if it does. Try again. Comes on to the... Maybe I need to do that first. There you go. Let's do that. That may help. There we go. And as you can see, there's an appropriate illustration. And that was, of course, Scotland the Brave plus the Black Bear, two fine traditional Highland bagpipe tunes. Military theorist in the chat says Waterloo vindicates Wellington as the best commander of the Napoleonic Wars. I would tend to agree with that. Certainly in terms of tactical commander, yeah, I think he was almost unbeatable.
I'm cautious about opening this because we're trying to end the stream. But my hot take is that Wellington wasn't even the best commander of the coalition forces. That would go to Alexander Suvorov. But I don't want to start a debate.
No, we won't do that now. We can do it another time, Jack, by all means. But I definitely, I think Wellington was probably the best tactical commander of the Napoleonic Wars. He was very difficult to beat. And he wasn't beaten. I mean, you can only...
Well, neither was Suvorov.
Yeah, I'm not denigrating Suvorov. I'm just pointing out that Wellington wasn't beaten, and you can only beat the people who fight you. And Wellington fought a lot of French marshals.
Didn't Suvorov die like 1798 or 1799 or thereabouts?
17, yeah, it was very early on in the French Revolutionary Wars, which is why he almost somewhat doesn't count. But he's a complicated one, because you could argue that his impact on the Napoleonic Wars was minimal. But as a commander, regardless of the specific campaign, he was the best of the ones on the coalition side. That
I've got a mate on Telegram who's Russian, and he says like he's been to the Suvorov military school. Like, he works in Russian artillery, so that guy's legacy still stands to this day.
Yes, he was the only Russian commander to get the rank of field marshal.
Yeah, I'm not criticizing this dude at all, Jack, but I would just say that the Napoleonic military tactics got more complicated as time went on.
And I'd say probably the commander that gave Napoleon the most trouble in what I would consider to be kind of his prime would be Archduke Charles von Teschen of Austria.
Yeah, Archduke Charles was extremely good. And as you say, Napoleon was in his prime at that time.
Yes, But, that 1809 campaign is interesting because it was a very close one, and also it was one where it's hard to point to it and say, oh, but there's this other factor and there's this other factor. They had quite equal armies, and there were no kind of external parties getting involved. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, the French probably had a slightly better army, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'd say all throughout the Napoleonic Wars, the French, as an entirety, had the strongest land-based military. But
the British were able to fight the French in the peninsula basically because of the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy could dominate the seas all around that peninsula. And supply the army and sometimes move them and launch raids against the French and what have you. Britain would not have been able to enjoy that sort of success almost anywhere else in Europe. Possibly in Italy, might have been the only other place. Wellington was easily the best British commander of the Napoleonic period, and he was certainly one of the best generals in the Napoleonic Wars. And again, look at his record. He was fighting for a very long time. He fought a lot of battles and he didn't lose any of them. So I will just say that. Anyway, thank you very much again to my guest. Jack, you are welcome to join us again. Thank you very much for your excellent contributions this evening.
It's been my pleasure to come on. Thank you.
I will just say before we close, next Wednesday, we're going to be doing Yemen and the British in Aden in the 1960s with Hitman.
Yeah, for 2 weeks' time, because I'm currently reading about the East India Company. So I don't. I'm up for doing East India Company because I mean that period of history is not really talked about. I tried to watch Kings and Generals covering it. I quit after like a minute because the guys just moralising about how evil the East India Company was.
Yeah, you find that a lot with a lot of modern trap, Mitch. I'm not going to commit to doing that in 2 weeks purely because I'm not sure I'm going to have enough time to do my research for that in 2 weeks. We will certainly do it, but maybe not in 2 weeks. But yeah, next week we're going to do Yemen and the British in Aden. Up to 1967, yeah, and that's with a bit of a Middle East specialist, so that's going to be more his stream than mine, but it should be good. And of course, we'll be back on Saturday with our normal Splendid Isolation current affairs and politics stream, 9:30 Saturday evening British time. And see you then. In the meantime, don't let the bastards grind you down.